Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
There is a question that hangs in the air of every barracks, every command tent, every war room where officers of the Astra Militarum gather to plan their next campaign. It is not spoken aloud in polite company, mind you, because polite company in the Imperium of man tends to involve commissars, and commissars tend to frown upon questions that might sound like they are comparing the Emperor's loyal servants to Xenos filth. But the question persists all the same, whispered between the clatter of mess hall trays and murmured beneath the thrum of chimera engines as regiments roll toward the next war zone. The question is this: when you strip away the noise, when you set aside the superstition and the prejudice and the 10,000 years of propaganda, are Ogryns actually better than Orks? Now, or before anyone out there starts clutching their copy of the Imperial Infantryman's uplifting primer and reporting me to the nearest inquisitorial agent, hear me out. This is not a question of loyalty. This is not a question of species supremacy or xenophilia. This is a cold, measured, almost academic comparison of two of the most physically imposing forces in the entire galaxy of Warhammer 40,000. On one side, you have the Orks, those green-skinned terrors who have plagued the galaxy since before the Imperium even existed, a species so resilient and so numerous that even the mightiest civilizations in galactic history could not wipe them out. On the other side, you have the Ogryns, those towering, thick-skulled, absurdly loyal abhumans who serve as the Astra Militarum's premier shock troops, as a subspecies of humanity that evolved on the harshest worlds the galaxy has to offer and came out the other side as walking battering rams with hearts of gold and the intelligence of a particularly enthusiastic retriever. Both are big, both are strong, both hit incredibly hard. Both have been known to use their enemies as improvised bludgeoning weapons when the mood strikes them. And both occupy a similar niche in the grand strategy of their respective factions. They are the blunt instruments, the sledgehammers, the forces that you point at a problem and let loose when subtlety has failed, and all that remains is the raw, primal arithmetic of muscle against armor. But there are differences between them, deep and fundamental differences that go all the way down to the cellular level, as to the very essence of what each species is and what they were made to be. And when you examine those differences with an honest eye and an open mind, when you weigh the strengths and weaknesses of each against the demands of war in the 41st millennium, a picture begins to emerge. A picture that might surprise you. Because the argument I'm going to make tonight, the case I'm going to lay out across the full breadth of this exploration, is that Ogryns are not just comparable to Orks. They are better. Better in ways that matter on the battlefield. Better in ways that matter off the battlefield. Better in ways that the Imperium has chronically underestimated for 10,000 years, and better in ways that the Orks themselves, for all their boisterous confidence and their reality-warping belief in their own superiority, cannot match. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. You are thinking that this is madness, that no abhuman subspecies, no matter how large or how strong, could possibly stack up against the most numerous and one of the most dangerous species in the entire galaxy. You are thinking about the green tides that have swept across star systems, the great crusades of destruction led by war bosses whose names are spoken with dread across 1,000 worlds. You are thinking about the sheer, overwhelming volume of violence that the Orks can bring to bear, the millions upon millions of fungoid warriors who pour out of their ramshackle warships like a flood of green rage. And you are right to think about those things, because they are real, and they are terrifying, and they have been the death of empires. But here is the thing about Orks that so many people forget, or perhaps choose not to examine too closely, because the truth of it undermines the comfortable narrative of the greenskins as an unstoppable force of nature. The truth is that for all their power, for all their numbers, for all their reality-bending psychic shenanigans, the Orks are fundamentally unreliable. They are a force of chaos in the most literal sense of the word, Not chaos with a capital C, mind you, though some have fallen to that as well, but chaos in the way that a wildfire is chaotic, or a storm, or an avalanche. They are a force that is as likely to destroy itself as it is to destroy its enemies. They fight among themselves as readily as they fight anyone else. Their technology works through what amounts to collective delusion, as their leaders maintain power only through the constant application of violence against their own subordinates, and their grand campaigns, their great stampeding crusades of destruction, inevitably stall and collapse the moment the biggest and meanest among them gets his head caved in by a power fist or a well-placed round of bolter fire. Ogryns, on the other hand, are reliable, dependable, consistent. They follow orders. They protect their comrades. They fight with everything they have, every single time, and they do not stop until the enemy is broken or they are dead. They do not turn on their allies in the middle of a battle because someone insulted their favorite squig. They do not spend half their time fighting each other over who has the shiniest piece of loot. And they do not require a constant stream of violence and intimidation just to stay pointed in the right direction. They are, in the truest sense of the word, soldiers. Brutish, dim-witted, occasionally catastrophically unhygienic soldiers, but soldiers nonetheless. So settle in, get comfortable, and let me walk you through every dimension of this comparison. Let me show you the origins of each species, the biology that drives them, the equipment they carry, the battles they have fought, and the legends they have spawned. Let me introduce you to heroes whose names deserve to be spoken alongside the greatest warriors the Imperium has ever produced, and villains whose brutality, while impressive, ultimately reveals more weakness than strength. And by the time we reach the end of this journey, I think you will agree with me that the Imperium has been sleeping on its biggest, most loyal, most underappreciated asset for far too long. This is the story of the Ogryns. And it begins, as all good stories do, a very, very long time ago, on worlds that most humans would consider a death sentence just to visit. Picture it. The age of technology, that golden era when humanity spread across the stars like seeds carried on an impossible wind, colonizing every world they could reach, no matter how hostile or how strange. Some of those worlds were paradise, lush garden planets where the living was easy, and the biggest challenge was deciding which sunset to watch. Others were hellscapes, frozen wastelands, or crushing high-gravity nightmares where the very air seemed to press down on your chest like the hand of an angry god. And on some of those hellscapes, on worlds so harsh and so unforgiving that they had been designated as penal colonies, as dumping grounds for the unwanted and the forgotten, something remarkable happened. The humans who had been abandoned there did not die. They adapted. Understand that this was not adaptation in the way that a person might adapt to a new climate by putting on a heavier coat. This was adaptation that took place over thousands of years, across countless generations, a slow and grinding process of natural selection that reshaped the very genome of the human beings who endured it. The high gravity of these worlds demanded strength, so their bones grew thicker and their muscles swelled with dense, powerful fibers that could move a body weighing hundreds of kilograms as easily as a baseline human might swing a club. The cold demanded resilience, so their skin thickened into a tough hide, their metabolisms cranked up to furnace-like intensity, and their bodies learned to store energy in vast reserves of fat and muscle that could sustain them through the long, lean stretches between meals. The constant danger demanded instinct over intellect, survival reflex over philosophical contemplation, so their minds narrowed and focused, shedding the capacity for complex abstract thought in favor of an almost preternatural awareness of threat and opportunity, of friend and foe, of things that could be eaten and things that needed to be killed. By the time the galaxy plunged into the darkness of the Age of Strife, when the warp storms cut these worlds off from the rest of humanity for thousands of years, that the people who lived on them had become something else entirely. They were still human, still carried the fundamental genetic signature of Homo sapiens within their cells, but they had diverged so far from the baseline that when the Emperor's forces rediscovered them during the Great Crusade, they could hardly be recognized as kin. They were enormous. The average adult stood somewhere around 10 feet tall, a full 3 meters of dense bone and corded muscle, and thick, scarred hide. They weighed close to 1,000 kilograms, and the largest among them could tip the scales at 4 times that. Their hands, broad and blunt-fingered, could crush ceramite with sustained pressure. Their legs could carry them at speeds that seemed impossible for creatures of their size. And their skulls, those magnificent, thick-walled, almost comically oversized skulls, were dense enough to shrug off blows that would have killed a baseline human 10 times over. They were Ogryns, Homo sapiens gigantus, and the Imperium, being the Imperium, took one look at them and thought, we can use these. Now, let us pause here for a moment and consider the other side of this comparison, because the origin story of the Orks is a very different kind of tale. Where the Ogryns were shaped by the blind, indifferent forces of natural selection, the Orks were built, engineered, designed from the ground up by being so ancient and so powerful that their very existence has passed into legend and myth. The Old Ones, those enigmatic reptilian entities who waged war against the Necrontyre and their star-devouring masters, the Satan, in what is remembered as the War in Heaven. They created the Orks to be the ultimate warrior species. They took the raw material of biology and bent it to a singular purpose: war. Everything about the Orks, from their physiology to their psychology to their bizarre fungoid reproductive cycle, was designed to serve that purpose. They were not evolved. They were manufactured. They are the product of deliberate, intelligent design, crafted by minds that understood warfare at a level that makes even the greatest strategists of the Imperium look like children playing with toy soldiers. And here is where things get interesting, because you might think that being intelligently designed would give the Orks an advantage over a species that was shaped by the random, undirected processes of evolution. You might think that a purpose-built weapon would always outperform something that just happened to stumble into violence through the accident of environmental pressure. But you would be wrong, and the reason you would be wrong reveals something profound about the nature of both species. The Orks were designed for war, and only for war. That is their strength, but it is also their weakness. They cannot stop fighting. They cannot focus on anything else. They cannot build a stable society, cannot maintain a lasting peace, cannot even keep themselves from tearing each other apart when there are no external enemies to occupy their attention. They are prisoners of their own design, locked into a cycle of violence that serves no purpose beyond perpetuating itself. Their technology, while often devastatingly effective, is fundamentally unreliable, dependent on a gestalt psychic field that makes things work simply because enough Orks believe they should. Their leadership structures are based entirely on physical dominance, which means that a single lucky shot, a single well-placed power claw, can throw an entire horde into chaos and disarray. They are a weapon without a safety catch, a fire that cannot be controlled, and while that makes them terrifying, it also makes them wasteful, inefficient, and ultimately self-defeating. Ogryns, by contrast, were shaped by something far more demanding than the deliberate hand of an ancient creator. They were shaped by the universe itself, by the merciless, impartial calculus of survival in environments where every day was a fight for life. And because they were shaped by survival rather than by war, they developed something that the Orks never could: the capacity for loyalty, for trust, for the kind of deep, abiding connection to other living beings that transcends the simple arithmetic of who can hit the hardest. An Ogryn does not follow its leader because that leader is the biggest and the strongest. An Ogryn follows its leader because it trusts that leader, believes in that leader, loves that leader with a devotion that is as pure and as unconditional as anything in the galaxy. And that, right there, is the fundamental advantage that makes Ogryns better than Orks. Not their strength, though their strength is formidable. Not their resilience, though their resilience is legendary. Not their size, though their size is imposing. It is their loyalty, their unwavering, unshakable, while almost supernatural loyalty to the people and the cause they serve. In a galaxy where betrayal is the norm and trust is a commodity rarer than adamantium, the Ogryns' loyalty is a weapon more powerful than any power claw or assault cannon. It is the bedrock upon which armies can be built, the anchor that holds a battle line together when everything else is falling apart, and the quality that, more than any other, makes them not just useful soldiers, but genuinely good ones. But I am getting ahead of myself. Before we can fully appreciate the superiority of the Ogryn, we need to understand both species in greater depth. We need to pull back the skin and examine the muscle and bone beneath, to look at the biology that drives these creatures and see how it shapes their capabilities on the battlefield. So let us begin there, with the raw physical material of each species, and see how they measure up when we put them side by side. The biology of an Ogryn is a testament to the power of natural selection operating under extreme conditions. Everything about an Ogryn's body is built for one purpose: to survive in environments that would kill a normal human in hours, if not minutes. Start with the skeleton. An Ogryn's bones are not merely larger versions of human bones. They are fundamentally different in their composition, denser and harder than anything found in a baseline human body, reinforced with layers of mineral deposits that make them almost ceramic in their toughness. The ribcage of an Ogryn is essentially a single, fused plate of bone, a natural armor that protects the vital organs within from impacts that would shatter a normal human's chest like a dropped plate. The joints are reinforced with extra cartilage and surrounded by thick sheaths of protective tissue, allowing them to withstand the enormous forces generated by the Ogryn's muscles without tearing or dislocating. And those muscles. Emperor above, those muscles. An Ogryn's musculature is unlike anything else in the human family tree. The muscle fibers are shorter and thicker than those of a baseline human, packed together in dense overlapping layers that provide an almost unbelievable strength-to-weight ratio. Where a human muscle might generate a few hundred newtons of force, an Ogryn's equivalent muscle group can produce forces measured in the thousands, enough to bend steel bars, crush ceramite armor, and, in the case of the legendary Nork Dedog, drag the wreckage of a Chimera armored transport vehicle across a battlefield while under fire. That vehicle, for those keeping score at home, weighs approximately 38 metric tons. Nork dragged it, while being shot at, by thousands of enemy troops, and apparently did not notice the wounds he sustained in the process. The skin of an Ogryn is another marvel of evolutionary engineering. It is not skin in the way that humans understand skin. It is a hide, a thick, tough, leathery covering that can be up to 3 inches thick in places, reinforced with fibrous bonding material that makes it extraordinarily resistant to penetration. Small arms fire, the kind of lasgun rounds and auto-stub projectiles that are the bread and butter of infantry combat in the 41st millennium, will often fail to penetrate an Ogryn's skin at all, bouncing off or lodging in the outer layers without reaching the flesh beneath. Even heavier weapons struggle to bring an Ogryn down, as the thick hide absorbs and disperses the energy of impacts across a wider area, reducing the damage to any single point. Combined with the Ogryn's enormous body mass and their thick layers of subcutaneous fat, which serves as both insulation against the cold of their homeworlds and an additional layer of impact protection, this hide makes them one of the most naturally armored species in the galaxy. And here is something else that does not get talked about enough: the Ogryn digestive system. On those barren, frozen prison worlds where the species first evolved, food was scarce, unpredictable, and often barely edible by any normal standard. The Ogryn digestive tract adapted accordingly, becoming a rugged, efficient machine that could extract nourishment from almost anything organic. Roots, bark, fungus, the tanned hides of dead animals, the bones of enemies, even soil in extreme cases. An Ogryn can eat things that would kill a baseline human and derive sustenance from them, which means that in the field, an Ogryn is far less dependent on supply chains than a conventional soldier. If the rations run out, the Ogryn will find something to eat. It might not be pleasant, it might not be appetizing, but it will keep the Ogryn alive and fighting And in the brutal calculus of warfare, that is what matters. The Ogryn metabolic rate is another remarkable adaptation. Their bodies run hot, burning through calories at an impressive rate, but also generating enormous amounts of energy when needed. An Ogryn can go from standing still to a full sprint in a matter of seconds, accelerating its massive body to speeds that seem impossible for something so large. Some accounts suggest that Ogryns can reach startling speeds in a full charge, which is frankly terrifying when you consider that the thing bearing down on you weighs as much as a small car and is not planning to stop when it reaches you. That burst of speed comes at a cost, of course. It burns through an Ogryn's energy reserves quickly, which means they cannot sustain high-intensity activity indefinitely. But in the context of a battlefield charge, where the distance between your starting position and the enemy is measured in hundreds of meters rather than kilometers, that burst is more than enough. There is also the matter of the Ogryn's senses, which are considerably more acute than those of a baseline human. Their hearing is particularly sharp, attuned to the low-frequency sounds that carry over long distances in the thin, cold atmospheres of their home worlds. They can detect approaching predators or enemies long before a human would notice anything amiss, which makes them surprisingly effective sentries and scouts, despite their lack of subtlety. Their sense of smell is also enhanced, useful for tracking prey across frozen wastes and, in the military context, for detecting ambushes and hidden enemies. These heightened senses, combined with their enormous physical presence, make Ogryns far more aware of their immediate environment than their reputation for stupidity might suggest. And we should talk about Ogryn resilience at the cellular level, because the adaptations go even deeper than the gross anatomy might suggest. The cells of an Ogryn's body are hardier than those of a baseline human, more resistant to radiation, to toxins, to extremes of temperature. Their immune systems, while not as exotic as the Orks' fungal redundancy, are robust and aggressive, capable of fighting off infections that would kill a normal human in days. This means that in the filthy, contaminated conditions that characterize most battlefields in the 41st millennium, where wounds are likely to become infected and disease is a constant companion, Ogryns have a significant survival advantage. They can take wounds that would become septic in a human and heal cleanly, their powerful immune response keeping the infection at bay while the wound knits closed. There is one more biological factor that deserves attention before we move on, and it concerns the Ogryns' emotional resilience. We know that Ogryns form deep emotional bonds with their comrades, and that they can experience grief and loss with an intensity that sometimes surprises those who work alongside them. But Ogryns also possess a remarkable capacity for emotional recovery. Their psychological framework, simplified and direct as it is, does not dwell on trauma the way a baseline human mind does. An Ogryn who loses a comrade will grieve, sometimes profoundly, but that grief does not spiral into the kind of chronic psychological damage that claims so many human soldiers in the 41st millennium. The Ogryn mourns, and then the Ogryn moves forward, carrying the memory of the fallen with it, but not being consumed by it. In an environment where post-traumatic stress and psychological breakdown are endemic among human soldiers, the Ogryns' emotional resilience is a significant operational advantage. This is not because Ogryns feel less. If anything, the evidence suggests they feel with a purity and an intensity that most humans would find overwhelming. But their emotional lives are uncomplicated in a way that shields them from the worst consequences of prolonged exposure to the horrors of war. They do not second-guess themselves. They do not lie awake at night wondering if they could have done something differently. They do not blame themselves for the deaths of comrades they could not save. They simply do their best, and they accept the outcome with a grace that seems almost spiritual in its simplicity. Now, let us compare this to the Orks. An Ork's body is a fascinating piece of biological engineering, no question about it. The old ones knew what they were doing when they designed the greenskins, and the result is a creature that is spectacularly well suited to its purpose. An Ork's physiology is a symbiosis of animal and fungal organisms, two separate biological systems that have been genetically intertwined to create something that is more than the sum of its parts. The animal component provides the basic structure, the bones and muscles and organs that allow an orc to move and fight and eat. The fungal component fills in the gaps, replacing many of the complex internal organs that would be vulnerable to damage in a human body with a simpler, more robust system that is much harder to destroy. An orc's bones are thick and hard, similar in many ways to an Ogryns, though the core of each bone is filled with a spongy fungal matter rather than traditional marrow. This makes them resilient to impact, but also gives the bones a degree of flexibility that can be both an advantage and a disadvantage, absorbing shock better, but providing less rigid support for the muscles attached to them. An orc's muscles are powerful, certainly, capable of generating the kinds of forces needed to swing a crude chopper through power armor or tear a human being limb from limb. But they are not organized in the same dense, layered configuration as an Ogryn's musculature. And an orc's strength comes more from the sheer mass of its muscle tissue than from any particular efficiency or density of the fibers themselves. The orc's internal organs are where the fungal symbiosis really shows its value. Where a human has a liver, a spleen, a pancreas, and a host of other specialized organs, each one a potential point of failure, an orc has what the Magos biologists of the Imperium have described as a fungal soup, a body cavity-filling mixture of fungal organisms that perform many of the same biochemical functions as those specialized organs, but in a distributed, redundant way. This means that an orc can suffer catastrophic damage to its torso, losing vast chunks of its internal cavity, and still survive, because the remaining fungal matter can compensate for the lost tissue. It also means that orcs heal remarkably quickly, as the fungal component can rapidly fill in wounds and restore function to damaged areas. This is impressive, and there is no denying that it gives orcs a significant advantage in terms of raw survivability. An orc can take hits that would kill a human, that would kill most things in the galaxy, and keep right on fighting as if nothing happened. There are accounts of orcs surviving bolter rounds to the head, severed limbs being reattached by their crude surgeons, and even decapitated orcs remaining active for short periods after the loss of their heads. The most famous example, of course, is Ghazghkull Thraka himself, the greatest warboss of the 41st Millennium, who had roughly 30% of his skull blown off by a bolter round and not only survived, but came back stronger and more dangerous than ever, thanks to the ministrations of Mad Doc Grotznik and a healthy helping of adamantium plating. But here is the thing that often gets overlooked in these discussions of orc resilience. Ogryns are also incredibly hard to kill. They do not have the fungal symbiosis of the orcs, it is true, but what they have instead is an almost ludicrous amount of raw physical toughness, combined with a pain threshold that borders on the non-existent. An Ogryn's body is so massive, so densely packed with muscle and bone and fat and tough, leathery hide, that it can absorb punishment that would drop an orc just as effectively as the greenskin's fungal redundancy. The difference is that where an orc survives through biological tricks, through the alien engineering of its hybrid physiology, an Ogryn survives through sheer, bloody-minded physical presence. There is simply so much of them that it takes an enormous amount of damage to find anything vital. Consider the case of Nork Deadog once more, because his career provides some of the best documented examples of Ogryn resilience in action. On the world of Pholax 4, Nork threw himself on top of an enemy grenade that would have killed Commander Richep, crushing both the grenade and the soldier who had thrown it beneath his massive body. The resulting explosion was, and I quote, muffled by Nork's body, and the Ogryn himself apparently noticed his resulting shrapnel wounds with only passing curiosity. A grenade went off underneath him, and he was mildly interested in the results. That is not just toughness. That is a fundamental recalibration of what it means to take damage. There is another dimension to the biology comparison that deserves attention, and it is one that cuts sharply in favor of the Ogryns: reproduction. Orks reproduce through spores, microscopic particles that they release throughout their lives and in massive quantities at the moment of death. These spores settle into the ground and grow through a cycle of increasingly complex organisms, from squigs to snotlings to Gretchen, and finally to full-grown orks. This is an enormously powerful reproductive strategy in terms of sheer numbers. A single ork can, over the course of its life, potentially give rise to hundreds or even thousands of new orkoid organisms. And a major battle in which many orks die can seed a planet with enough spores to produce a new ork population within a few decades. This is why orks are so incredibly difficult to eradicate. You can win every battle, kill every ork on the planet's surface, and still find yourself fighting feral ork tribes 20 years later, grown from the spores left behind by the original invasion. It is a nightmare for any occupying force, and it is one of the primary reasons why the orks remain such a persistent threat across the galaxy. But here is the flip side of that coin. The ork reproductive strategy produces quantity, not quality. Every ork that pops out of the ground is, at a fundamental level, the same as every other ork. They come preloaded with a set of genetically encoded instincts and knowledge, yes, but they have no upbringing. No culture beyond what they absorb from the orks around them. No familial bonds, no personal history. They are, in a very real sense, disposable. They are biological ammunition, produced in bulk and spent without hesitation, because there are always more where they came from. Ogryns reproduce the old-fashioned way, through sexual reproduction and the gestation and birth of individual offspring. This means that their numbers are far more limited than those of the orks. You cannot seed a world with Ogryn spores and come back in 20 years to find a new population waiting for you. Each Ogryn is born, raised, fed, trained, and integrated into a community, a process that takes years and requires resources and attention. In terms of raw numerical output, the orks have an overwhelming advantage. But numerical output is not the only measure of a species' reproductive success, and this is where the Ogryn strategy starts to look a lot more appealing, because each Ogryn is an individual. Each one has a history, a personality, a set of relationships and loyalties that bind it to the people and the cause it serves. Each one is, in a very real sense, irreplaceable, and this makes them more valuable, not less. An Ogryn who has fought beside a regiment for years, who knows the faces of his comrades and the sound of his commissar's voice, who has learned through experience which sounds mean danger and which means safety, is a vastly more effective soldier than a fresh-grown ork boy who emerged from the ground last week with nothing but instinct and aggression to guide him. Quality versus quantity. And in the long run, quality wins. Now, I mentioned loyalty earlier, and I want to come back to it, because it is perhaps the most important factor in this entire comparison, and it deserves a thorough examination. Loyalty is not a concept that the orks understand. The ork social structure is based entirely on dominance, on the simple and brutal principle that the biggest and the strongest get to tell everyone else what to do, and anyone who does not like it gets their skull caved in. There is no trust in ork society, no mutual respect, no sense of obligation beyond the immediate calculus of who can beat whom in a fight. An ork follows its war boss because the war boss is bigger and meaner than it is. And the moment the war boss shows weakness, the knobs beneath him will be at his throat, fighting among themselves for the right to take his place. And it is a system that rewards aggression and punishes weakness. And while it produces formidable individual fighters, it makes for a deeply unstable society and an unreliable fighting force. This is the ork's greatest strategic weakness, and it has been exploited by Imperial commanders time and time again throughout the long history of the Imperium. Kill the war boss, and the horde falls apart. It is that simple. Not immediately, of course, and not always cleanly, but the fundamental dynamic is always the same. When the biggest and the strongest is removed from the equation, the remaining orks turn on each other, fighting for dominance and scattering into smaller, less dangerous warband fragments that can be dealt with piecemeal. Every great Ork invasion, and every terrifying Green Crusade that has threatened to overwhelm whole sectors of Imperial space, has eventually collapsed for this reason. The Greenskins simply cannot maintain cohesion without a strong leader to keep them pointed in the right direction, and even the strongest leaders eventually fall. Now compare this to the Ogryns. An Ogryn's loyalty is not based on dominance. It is not based on fear or the threat of violence. It is based on something far deeper, far more powerful, far more durable. Love. Yes, love. I know that sounds absurd in the context of the grim darkness of the far future, but it is the most accurate word for what the Ogryns feel toward the people and the institutions they serve. When an Ogryn is inducted into the imperial cult, yet when it is taught that the Emperor of mankind watches over it and cares for it, and that every order it receives has come down the chain of command from the God Emperor himself, it believes this with a fervor that puts the most devoted battle sister to shame. An Ogryn's faith is absolute, uncomplicated, and unshakable. It does not question, it does not doubt. It simply believes, with every fiber of its enormous being, that the Emperor loves it and that serving the Emperor is the highest calling any creature can aspire to. This faith extends to the Ogryn's immediate comrades and commanders as well. Once an Ogryn bonds with a human soldier or officer, that bond is almost impossible to break. The Ogryn will protect that person with its life, not because it has been ordered to, but because it genuinely cares about them. It will throw itself on grenades, drag armored vehicles through hostile fire, and wade through enemy formations to reach a wounded comrade, all without a moment's hesitation.
Now, real talk for a second, I've been deep in the lore for this one, and honestly, making this script changed how I think about Ogryns entirely. I always liked them. Sure, they're funny, they're big, they hit stuff, but sitting down and actually pulling apart everything they bring to the table compared to Orks, it stopped being a meme argument for me. These guys genuinely might be the most underrated asset in the entire Imperium. Like, the loyalty angle alone is something I didn't fully appreciate until I started reading about Nork D-Dog dragging that Chimera through a war zone just to keep one officer alive. That's not programming, that's not instinct, that's love, plain and simple. And I think that's what makes this topic hit different from your usual faction versus faction debate. But anyways, let's get back to the video.
The Darktide short story about the Ogryn named Tig captures this beautifully, describing a creature of immense physical power who processes the world differently from those around him, but whose loyalty and devotion to his squadmates is beyond question, beyond reproach, and beyond anything that a rational calculation of risk and reward could explain. This loyalty has practical implications that go far beyond the emotional. On the battlefield, it means that Ogryn units do not break, they do not flee, they do not turn on their allies or scatter when the going gets tough. They hold the line every single time until they are physically incapable of holding it any longer. This makes them one of the most reliable defensive assets in the Astra Militarum's arsenal, a rock that enemy forces break against like waves against a cliff. And in offensive operations, their single-minded determination to reach the enemy and protect their comrades makes them devastatingly effective shock troops, creatures that will charge into the teeth of enemy fire without flinching and tear apart anything that stands between them and their objective. The Orks cannot match this. For all their ferocity, for all their love of violence, the Orks are fundamentally selfish creatures. Each Ork fights for itself first and its tribe second, and the moment the tide turns against them, the weaker among them will break and run, leaving their fellows to fend for themselves, even the nobs, even the hunts. It's those larger and more formidable Orks who serve as the greenskin equivalent of officers are motivated primarily by self-interest, maintaining their position through intimidation rather than inspiration. There is no Ork equivalent of Nork Deadog throwing himself on a grenade to save his commander. There is no Ork equivalent of Urok, the Ogryn who served alongside the 233rd Katakan jungle fighters and became so attached to his human comrades that he called them little uns and wept when they fell. The The concept is simply alien to the greenskin mind. And this brings us to another fascinating dimension of the comparison: intelligence. Now, I know what you are thinking. Ogryns are not exactly renowned for their intellectual prowess. The running joke in the Astra Militarum is that the smartest Ogryn in the regiment is the one who can count to 4, and even that is considered an exceptional achievement. And there is truth in this. Ogryns are, by baseline human standards, profoundly intellectually limited. Their capacity for abstract thought, for complex problem solving, for the kind of strategic and tactical reasoning that human officers take for granted, is severely curtailed. They have difficulty remembering things, struggle with anything more complex than the most basic verbal instructions, and are easily confused by unfamiliar situations or unexpected changes in their environment. But here is the thing that the jokes and the stereotypes miss. Ogryn intelligence did not actually atrophy, it specialized. The Ogryn brain is not a diminished version of a human brain. It is a reconfigured one, optimized for a very specific set of tasks that were critical to survival on the harsh worlds where the species evolved. An Ogryn's spatial awareness is extraordinary. Their ability to read the physical environment, to sense danger, to detect threats through subtle cues of sound and smell and vibration, is far superior to that of a baseline human. Their social intelligence, the ability to read the emotional states and intentions of the people around them, is also surprisingly sophisticated, though it manifests in ways that humans often fail to recognize because the Ogryns cannot articulate what they perceive. This is not to say that Ogryns are secretly geniuses who just have trouble expressing themselves. They are not. Their intellectual limitations are real, and they have real consequences on the battlefield. But the common perception that Ogryns are dumber than Orks is simply not accurate. In fact, the official lore of the Warhammer 40,000 universe makes this explicit. While Ogryns are said to have intelligence levels comparable to, or even lower than some Orks, the reality is that their intelligence is differently distributed rather than simply reduced. An Ogryn may not be able to plan a flanking maneuver, but it can read the flow of a battle at an instinctive level, sensing when the momentum is shifting and responding accordingly. It may not understand the strategic significance of holding a particular position, but it understands loyalty and duty, and it will hold that position until it is physically pulled away. And then there are the boneheads. This is where the comparison with Orks really starts to break down. Because the Imperium has a way to make Ogryns smarter, and there is nothing comparable in Ork society. The biochemical Ogryn neural enhancement procedure, known by the wonderfully appropriate acronym BONE, is a process of chemical treatment, surgical modification, and cybernetic implantation that can significantly boost an Ogryn's cognitive capabilities. A bonehead, as the recipients of this procedure are affectionately known, is an Ogryn who can remember its own name, count on its fingers, follow complex, multi-step orders, and even make independent tactical decisions in the field. By Ogryn standards, this makes them geniuses. By human standards, it makes them roughly equivalent to a somewhat slow but extremely determined child, which is a massive improvement over the baseline and which unlocks a whole new level of battlefield utility. Boneheads serve as the sergeants of Ogryn squads, the conduit through which orders flow from human officers to the rank-and-file Ogryns. They are able to interpret instructions, relay them in terms that their fellow Ogryns can understand, and adjust their squad's behavior in response to changing conditions on the battlefield. They are not strategists, but they are leaders, and the combination of their enhanced cognitive abilities with their natural Ogryn physical prowess and loyalty makes them formidable battlefield assets. Other Ogryns follow boneheads not because they are intimidated by them, as a knob intimidates the boys in an Ork warband, but because they recognize and respect the bonehead's greater understanding. The bonehead's authority is based on competence and trust, not on violence and fear. And this makes for a far more stable and effective command structure than anything the Orks can produce. The Orks have nothing equivalent to the bonehead. There is no procedure to make an Ork boy smarter, no way to enhance their cognitive abilities beyond what their genetics and their position in the Orkoid hierarchy naturally provide. Ork intelligence scales with size and success, with the biggest and most successful orcs developing greater cognitive abilities as a natural consequence of their growth. But this is an uncontrolled, unmodifiable process that cannot be directed or enhanced by external means. A knob is smarter than a boy because it is bigger and has fought more, not because anyone did anything to make it smarter. And a warboss is smarter than a knob for the same reason. But there is no way to take an average orc boy and give it a cognitive boost the way the bone procedure does for an Ogryn. Some might argue that the orc mech boys and pain boys represent a form of enhanced intelligence, but these are not enhancements so much as they are expressions of genetically encoded knowledge. A mech boy does not learn to build things. It knows how to build things instinctively from the moment it is born, because the old ones programmed that knowledge into the orc genome millions of years ago. It is not intelligence in the way that humans or Ogryns understand it. It is programming, and it is as inflexible and as limited as any other form of hard-coded instinct. Let us turn now to the matter of equipment and weaponry. First, because the tools that each species brings to the battlefield tell us a great deal about their respective capabilities and limitations. The standard Ogryn is equipped with a few key items, all of them designed with the particular needs of their enormous wielders in mind. The primary weapon of the Ogryn is the Ripper gun, a brutishly simple but devastatingly effective automatic weapon that fires solid slugs at a prodigious rate. The Ripper gun is not a precision instrument by any stretch of the imagination. It is loud, it is heavy, it sprays rounds in a general direction rather than placing them on specific targets, and it burns through ammunition at a rate that has necessitated the installation of burst limiters to prevent over-enthusiastic Ogryns from emptying their magazines in the first 30 seconds of a fight. But what it lacks in finesse, it more than makes up for in raw stopping power. A burst from a Ripper gun can shred light vehicles, pulverize infantry, and turn even heavily armored targets into a mess of torn metal and ruptured flesh. The Ripper gun also doubles as a melee weapon because of course it does. When the shooting is done and the fighting gets close, an Ogryn will use its Ripper gun as a club, swinging the massive weapon with enough force to crush skulls and buckle armor plate. This dual-purpose design reflects the practical realities of equipping a species that is both incredibly strong and intellectually limited. Give an Ogryn too many weapons, and it will forget which one it is supposed to use. Give it one weapon that does everything, and it will use it enthusiastically and effectively in every situation. In addition to the Ripper gun, Ogryns are typically equipped with flak armor, a robust and straightforward form of protection that supplements their already formidable natural toughness, and frag bombs, simple explosive devices that the Ogryns can throw with impressive force and occasionally alarming inaccuracy. The equipment is designed to be nearly indestructible, because anything within arm's reach of an Ogryn is likely to see brief and violent service as an improvised club, whether it was designed for that purpose or not. Then there are the Bullgryns, the heavy variant of the Ogryn soldier, and this is where the Imperium's investment in Ogryn warfare really starts to pay dividends. Bullgryns are the most obstinate, the most resilient, the most aggressively inclined Ogryns in a given regiment, as selected for their exceptional toughness and outfitted with specialized equipment that turns them into walking fortresses. They wear custom-made carapace armor fashioned from discarded tank tracks, a characteristically Ogryn solution that takes something designed for an entirely different purpose and repurposes it through sheer brute force into something that works. And it does work. A Bullgryn in full carapace armor is one of the most durable infantry units in the entire Astra Militarum, capable of shrugging off small arms fire, absorbing anti-tank rounds, and generally making a nuisance of itself in ways that force enemy commanders to divert heavy weapons away from more strategically important targets. The Bullgryn's armament is where things get really interesting. They carry either grenadier gauntlets, which are essentially oversized grenade launchers strapped to their forearms, allowing them to bombard the enemy with explosive munitions at close range while keeping one hand free for melee combat, or power mauls, which are exactly what they sound like. Enormous, powered bludgeoning weapons that can crush through armor, bone, and spirit with equal ease. For defense, they carry either slab shields, enormous rectangular barriers that can interlock to form a mobile wall of metal, and faith that provides cover not just for the Ogryns themselves, but for the human soldiers advancing behind them, or brute shields, smaller and more maneuverable defensive tools that sacrifice some of that coverage for greater combat flexibility. As the sight of a Ogryn shield wall advancing across a battlefield is one of the most iconic and terrifying images in Astra Militarum warfare. Picture it. A line of enormous armored figures, each one 10 feet tall and nearly as wide, marching forward in lockstep with their shields raised, absorbing a storm of enemy fire that would annihilate a conventional infantry formation. Behind them, sheltered by the walking wall of metal and muscle, human soldiers advance with their weapons ready, pouring fire over and around their enormous protectors. The enemy faces an impossible choice. Concentrate fire on the Ogryns, who are almost impossibly tough and whose shields are designed to absorb exactly this kind of punishment, or try to reach the humans behind them, who are effectively shielded by a mobile fortress. Now, let's compare this to what the Orks bring to the table in terms of equipment. Ork weapons and armor are, to put it charitably, rustic. To put it less charitably, they are piles of scrap metal held together by spit, prayers to Gork and Mork, and a collective psychic field that convinces them they should work. Ork technology is a paradox wrapped in an enigma, bolted onto a truck that someone painted red because they believed it would make it go faster. And the insane thing is that it does go faster, because enough Orks believe it does. And the Gestalt psychic field, generated by greenskin belief, is powerful enough to warp the very fabric of reality to match their expectations. This is the famous Ork belief effect, and it is simultaneously the most fascinating and the most frustrating aspect of greenskin technology. Ork weapons should not work. Their guns are often little more than tubes with holes at each end, loaded with whatever loose ammunition happens to be lying around. Their vehicles are held together with wire and hope. Their armor is salvaged from battle wreckage and hammered into shape with rocks. By any rational standard of engineering, none of it should function at all. And indeed, when humans attempt to use captured Ork equipment, it frequently does not. The Gestalt psychic field fills in the gaps that shoddy construction leaves behind, making Ork weapons more accurate, more powerful, and more reliable than they have any right to be, but only when wielded by Orks. This is a significant advantage in its way. It means that the Orks never have to worry about supply chains or manufacturing standards or quality control. Well, they can arm themselves with whatever they can scavenge, and the collective belief of the Horde will make it work. But it is also a significant liability because it means that Ork technology is fundamentally unpredictable. You never know exactly what a given weapon or vehicle will do until it does it. And sometimes what it does is explode in the face of the Ork using it, or simply fail to fire at a critical moment because the psychic field was not quite strong enough to bridge the gap between rusty tube and functional weapon. Imperial technology, by contrast, is reliable. It may not be elegant, it may not be cutting edge, and it may require a small army of tech priests to maintain, but it works. Consistently, predictably, every time. An Ogryns Ripper gun will fire when the trigger is pulled. Or a Ogryn slab shield will stop the rounds it is designed to stop. The equipment may be crude by the standards of some factions, but it is purpose-built, rigorously tested, and maintained by a military-industrial complex that has been refining its products for 10,000 years. In a war of attrition, where consistency and reliability matter more than occasional flashes of improbable brilliance, this is an enormous advantage. Let me paint a picture for you now. Let me take you to the battlefield, where these two species meet in the kind of close, brutal, grinding combat that defines warfare in the 41st millennium, and show you what happens when Ogryn muscle meets Ork aggression in the contested ground between two armies. The battle is on an agri-world, one of those vast, flat, featureless planets where the Imperium grows the food that feeds a million other worlds. The Orks have come in their ramshackle ships, drawn by some primal instinct to the nearest source of conflict, and they have spilled out across the planet's surface in a green flood of noise and violence. The Astra Militarum garrison is dug in along a line of fortified positions, trenches and bunkers and gun emplacements that stretch across the landscape like a scar. The Orks are advancing, a mob so vast that it stretches from horizon to horizon, a sea of green flesh and rusty metal surging forward with the unstoppable momentum of a natural disaster. The ground trembles with the weight of their footsteps. The air shakes with the thunder of their weapons and the sound of their war chant, that deep or primal roar that is as much a psychic phenomenon as a physical one, a collective expression of joy and rage and hunger for violence that can be felt in the bones of every living thing within earshot. The human soldiers in the trenches are afraid. Of course they are afraid. They are mortal men and women, flesh and blood and fragile hope, facing a tide of violence that seems as inevitable and as impersonal as the tide of the ocean. Their lasguns are charged and ready, their bayonets fixed, their prayers whispered with desperate sincerity. They know the odds. They have seen the picked feeds from other worlds, other battles, other lines that broke beneath the weight of the green tide. They know that when the Orks reach the trenches, the fighting will be close and brutal and terrible, and many of them will not survive it. And then they hear a sound that cuts through the terror like a knife, a sound that is different from the roar of the Ork advance, different from the crack of lasguns and the boom of artillery. It is the sound of heavy footsteps, enormously heavy footsteps, and the deep, booming voices of creatures so large that the ground vibrates when they walk. The Ogryns are coming. They emerge from the reserve positions behind the front line, a squad of 10 enormous figures in battered flak armor, their ripper guns held at the hip, their faces set in expressions of simple, fierce determination. At their head is a bonehead, a slightly larger figure, with the telltale metallic glint of cerebral implants visible beneath the scarred skin of his skull. And he is bellowing orders in a voice that could be heard over a baneblade firing its main cannon. "Orks is that way. We go smash 'em." It is not the most sophisticated tactical briefing in the history of warfare, but it is effective. The Ogryns understand what is expected of them. They accelerate, their enormous legs eating up the ground in great, thundering strides, and they hit the Ork advance like a battering ram. The impact is enormous, physical and psychological, a wall of Ogryn muscle slamming into the front edge of the green tide with a force that sends bodies flying and weapons spinning. Ripper guns roar, their heavy slugs tearing through Ork flesh at point-blank range, and then the guns themselves become clubs, wielded by arms that could tear a tank apart, and the real butchery begins. This is where the Ogryn advantage becomes most apparent, in the close, confused, and savagely intimate combat that defines infantry warfare in the 41st millennium. The Ogryn is in its element. Its enormous size gives it a commanding view of the immediate battlefield, allowing it to see threats that the human soldiers around it cannot. Its incredible strength means that every blow is potentially lethal, that even the largest and most armored Orks can be brought down by a single well-placed swing. Its thick hide and dense musculature absorb punishment that would kill anything smaller, keeping it on its feet and fighting long after a lesser creature would have fallen. And its loyalty, that unshakable, unconditional loyalty, keeps it fighting not just for itself, but for the human soldiers it has come to protect, the little uns who look up at the Ogryns with something that, in the grim darkness of the far future, it might almost be called love. The Orks fight back, of course. They always do. They are bred for this, engineered for this. Their entire existence a preparation for this kind of savage, close-quarters brutality. And they are good at it. A Nob, the larger and more aggressive Ork equivalent of a squad leader, can match an Ogryn blow for blow, trading strikes with a power claw or a massive chopper that would bisect a normal human. But the Nob fights for itself, for glory, for the satisfaction of violence. The Ogryn fights for its squad, for its regiment, for the Emperor and the Imperium, and the comrades who depend on it. And in the grinding, attritive calculus of infantry combat, where the side that holds together longer wins, that makes all the difference. The Orks waver, not because they are weak, not because they are afraid, but because their cohesion is based on momentum and aggression. And when that momentum is checked, when that aggression meets something that will not yield, the whole structure begins to crack. The boys at the back of the mob cannot see what is happening at the front. They do not know that a wall of Ogryn muscle has stopped the advance dead. They start to mill about, confused and frustrated, looking for someone to hit. Some of them start hitting each other. The Nobs try to restore order, cracking heads and bellowing threats, but the damage is done. The advance has stalled, the momentum is broken, and the artillery that has been waiting for exactly this moment begins to fall. The Ogryns hold the line. They always hold the line. This scenario I have just described is not fiction, by the way. It is a composite drawn from dozens of real accounts in the lore, from after-action reports filed by commissars and generals and tech priests across thousands of years and thousands of worlds. The deployment of Ogryns as the cork in the bottle, the immovable object against the unstoppable force, is one of the oldest and most reliable tactics in the Astra Militarum playbook. And the reason it keeps being used is that it keeps working. Not sometimes, not usually, always. Consider the tactical implications more carefully. When a general knows that a particular section of the line is going to face the heaviest enemy pressure, where does he put his Ogryns? He puts them right in the teeth of it, right in the kill zone, right in the place where the fighting will be most savage and most close, and they hold. They hold because they are too tough to kill quickly, too strong to push back, too loyal to break, and too simple to know that they should be afraid. While the Ogryns are absorbing the brunt of the enemy assault, the general can maneuver his other assets, reposition his artillery, bring up reserves, coordinate flanking attacks, and generally do all the clever strategic things that win wars. The Ogryns do not need to be clever, they just need to be there, and they always are. There is a beautiful simplicity to this that cuts to the heart of effective military strategy. The best tool for the job is the one that works every time, and Ogryns work every time. They are the most reliable element in an army that is otherwise plagued by unreliable equipment, unreliable morale, unreliable logistics, and unreliable allies. But when everything else goes wrong, when the plan falls apart and the communications break down and the flanking force gets lost and the artillery hits the wrong target, the Ogryns will still be doing exactly what they were told to do, exactly where they were told to do it. You can set your chrono by an Ogryn. Now, let me paint another picture for you, because the battle I described above was a defensive engagement, and Ogryns are just as effective on the attack. Imagine an urban environment, a hive city that has been overrun by Ork forces and that needs to be reclaimed block by block, building by building, room by room. This is the most brutal and demanding form of warfare imaginable. Our close quarters combat in confined spaces where the advantages of range and maneuver are negated, and everything comes down to who can hit harder and take more punishment. In this environment, the Ogryn is king. Its enormous size, which might be a liability in open terrain where it presents a large target for enemy fire, becomes an advantage in close quarters where it can use its mass to dominate doorways, corridors, and intersections. An Ogryn advancing through a hab-block corridor is an almost unstoppable force, a wall of muscle and armor that fills the entire passageway and pushes everything in front of it backward through sheer physical pressure. Enemy combatants who try to stand and fight are simply overwhelmed by the Ogryn's strength and mass. Their weapons and their courage equally insufficient against a creature that can absorb their best shots and keep coming. The Orks excel in urban combat too, of course. Their love of close-quarters violence and their fearless aggression make them formidable opponents in built-up areas. But the Ork approach to urban warfare is characteristically chaotic, a swarm of individual fighters pouring through every available opening with no coordination and no plan beyond finding something to hit. This can be effective through sheer weight of numbers, but it is also wasteful and unpredictable. Orc mobs in an urban environment are as likely to start fighting each other as they are to fight the enemy, especially if they get separated from their nob and lose the immediate threat of violent reprisal that keeps them focused. The Ogryns, guided by their bonehead and backed by the tactical direction of their human officers, advance through the urban landscape with a methodical purposefulness that the Orcs cannot match. They clear buildings systematically, moving from room to room, with a combination of overwhelming force and surprising patience. An Ogryn will not rush into a room without checking it first, not because it is smart enough to understand the concept of room-clearing tactics, but because the bonehead has told it to wait, and the Ogryn trusts the bonehead, and so it waits. And when the bonehead gives the signal, the Ogryn goes in with everything it has, ripper gun blazing, massive fists swinging, and whatever was hiding in that room is no longer a problem. The human soldiers who follow in the Ogryn's wake often describe the experience in almost reverent terms. When it is, they say, like advancing behind a living bulldozer, a creature that absorbs everything the enemy throws at it and leaves nothing but silence in its wake. The guardsmen who serve alongside Ogryns develop a deep, almost proprietary affection for them, an affection that is reciprocated with an Ogryn's characteristic enthusiasm. These bonds, forged in the crucible of shared combat, are among the strongest in the Astra Militarum, and they create units whose cohesion and fighting spirit are out of all proportion to what you might expect from an army that relies on conscription and a prayer to keep its ranks full. Let me also describe what happens when Ogryns encounter Orcs on the battlefield specifically, because these engagements have a character all their own. When an Ogryn faces an Orc in close combat, the resulting confrontation is one of the most viscerally impressive spectacles in all of Warhammer 40,000. Both creatures are enormous. Both are incredibly strong. Both possess a natural aptitude for violence that goes beyond mere training or instinct. But there are subtle differences in how they fight that reveal the deeper differences between the two species. An Orc fights with joy. It loves combat the way a fish loves water, the way a bird loves the air. Every punch, every swing of the chopper, every bellowed battle cry is an expression of pure, unalloyed happiness. Fighting is what the Orc was born to do, what every fiber of its being demands. And when it is in the thick of a scrap, it is the most content creature in the galaxy. This makes the Orc a fierce and aggressive opponent, and one that presses the attack relentlessly and refuses to give ground, even when the tactical situation clearly calls for withdrawal. An Ogryn fights with purpose, not the cold, calculated purpose of a space marine or an elder warrior, but the simple, unshakable purpose of a creature that knows exactly what it is fighting for and will not stop until that purpose is fulfilled. When an Ogryn swings its ripper gun at an Orc's head, it does so not because it enjoys the act of violence itself, though it probably does on some level, but because the Orc is between the Ogryn and the thing the Ogryn is trying to protect. The Ogryn's aggression is not random or undirected. It is focused, purposeful, and entirely subordinated to the demands of the mission. This difference in motivation has practical consequences in combat. And an Orc in a fight will sometimes get so caught up in the joy of the scrap that it loses track of the larger tactical situation. It will chase a fleeing opponent when it should be holding its ground. It will stop to gloat over a fallen enemy when it should be pressing the advantage. It will challenge the biggest and toughest opponent in the area to single combat, when the smartest move would be to attack the weakest point in the enemy line. These lapses in tactical discipline are a direct consequence of the Orc's combat psychology, which prioritizes the subjective experience of fighting over the objective requirements of winning. The Ogryn does not make these mistakes. The Ogryn stays where it is told to stay. The Ogryn fights what it is told to fight. The Ogryn does not chase. The Ogryn does not gloat. Why, the Ogryn does what it was told to do and then waits for more instructions, because that is what good soldiers do. And the Ogryn is, at its core, a very good soldier. Not a sophisticated one, not a flexible one, not a creative or innovative one, but a good one, a reliable one. A soldier that its commander can count on absolutely, and in the fog and chaos of battle, that is worth more than 1,000 brilliant individualists who might or might not follow orders depending on how they feel at the moment. Now let me take you to perhaps the single most relevant theatre of war for this entire comparison: Armageddon. Because if there is one place in the galaxy where the Ogryn and the Ork have been measured against each other in the most direct and sustained fashion possible, it is on the ash wastes and hive cities of that battered, blood-soaked world. The wars for Armageddon are among the largest and most well-documented conflicts in the recent history of the Imperium, and they provide us with an extraordinary case study in how both species perform under the most extreme conditions. The Second War for Armageddon, launched by Gazkul Mag Uruk Thraka in the closing years of the 41st Millennium, saw the largest Ork invasion force in centuries descend upon the world like a green avalanche. 50 million greenskins, by some estimates, poured onto the planet's surface, backed by stompas, gargants, and every variety of ramshackle war machine the Ork mech boys could cobble together. The Imperial defenders included dozens of Astra Militarum regiments, supported by elements of 3 Space Marine chapters, most notably the Blood Angels, the Salamanders, and the Ultramarines. But among those defenders were also significant contingents of Ogryn Auxilia, attached to the various guard regiments that had been rushed to the planet's defense. The Monglor Ogryn Auxilia were present at the Battle of Hell's Reach, one of the most brutal urban engagements of the entire war, and their performance there became the stuff of legend within the Astra Militarum. Hell's Reach was a nightmare. The Hive City's vast industrial districts became a labyrinth of close-quarters killing zones, where visibility was measured in meters and life expectancy was measured in hours. The Orks poured into the city in endless waves, their boys flooding the corridors and hab blocks and factory floors with the kind of reckless, screaming abandon that only Orks can manage. Human guardsmen fought and died in their thousands, while holding barricades and choke points against opponents who simply did not stop coming. The stress on the defenders was beyond description. Sleep was impossible. Resupply was sporadic at best. The constant noise, the screaming and the gunfire, and the guttural howling of the Ork advance ground down even the hardiest soldiers. In this environment, the Ogryns were indispensable, where human soldiers could hold a position for hours before needing to rotate out. Ogryns could hold for days. Where human soldiers needed barricades and fortifications to create a defensible position, an Ogryn was a defensible position, its massive body blocking entire corridors and its Ripper gun sweeping the approach with a volume of fire that would require 3 or 4 human soldiers to replicate. While the Monglor Ogryns were rotated between the most critical choke points in the city, deployed wherever the Ork advance threatened to break through, and at every position they held, the line held with them. There is a particular engagement from Hell's Reach that deserves detailed attention. In the industrial sector, designated Zone 17, a force of approximately 40 Ork nobs, the larger, meaner, more experienced Orks that served as sergeants and squad leaders in the Greenskin Horde, managed to break through the primary defensive line and push deep into the Imperial rear. They were heading for a field hospital where hundreds of wounded guardsmen lay helpless, and the only force standing between the nobs and the hospital was a single squad of Monglor Ogryns, 6 individuals, led by a bonehead whose name, unfortunately, has been lost to the administrative chaos that followed the war. 40 nobs against 6 Ogryns. The numbers were terrible, but the Ogryns did not run, and they did not fall back, and they did not ask for reinforcement, because they had been told to hold that position and protect the hospital, and that was exactly what they intended to do. The fight lasted nearly an hour. The Ogryns used the narrow corridor to their advantage, standing shoulder to shoulder in a wall of flesh and ceramite that the knobs simply could not get past. The Ripper guns spoke in a continuous roar, their heavy slugs and shotgun blasts tearing into the densely packed Ork formation at point-blank range. When the ammunition ran dry, the Ogryns used the guns as clubs, swinging the heavy weapons with devastating force. When even that failed, they used their fists, their feet, their heads, anything and everything they had. By the time a relief force of Catachan jungle fighters arrived, 3 of the 6 Ogryns were dead, and the other 3 were wounded badly enough that a human soldier would have been unconscious. But they were still standing, still holding the line, still blocking the corridor with their battered, bleeding, indomitable bodies. And in front of them lay the remains of 32 Ork knobs, killed by the Ogryns' stubborn refusal to accept that they were supposed to lose this fight. The remaining 8 knobs had retreated, broken not by superior firepower, but by the sheer, unyielding stubbornness of creatures who simply would not stop fighting. That engagement tells you everything you need to know about the difference between Ogryn resolve and Ork aggression. The Orks had every advantage, and numbers, momentum, the fury of their charge. But the Ogryns had something the Orks could not match, something that no amount of green muscle and crude weaponry could overcome, a reason to fight that went beyond the love of violence. Those Ogryns were not fighting because they enjoyed it, though perhaps they did. They were fighting because there were wounded soldiers behind them, helpless people who depended on the Ogryns for protection, and the Ogryns would rather die than let those people down. The Third War for Armageddon, which followed some 57 years after the Second, was if anything even larger and more devastating. Ghazghkull returned with a force estimated at over 100 million Orks, a green tide so vast that it beggared the imagination. The entire planet became a war zone, with fighting ranging from the equatorial jungles to the polar ice caps, from the hive cities to the orbital stations high above the atmosphere. Once again, Ogryn Auxilia units played a critical role in the defense. The Krork Ogryn Auxilia, famous throughout the Imperium for their warlike culture and their ferocious fighting spirit, were deployed in the defense of Hive Volcanus, where they faced repeated assaults by Goth clan Orks, the largest and most combat-focused of all the Ork clans. The Goths pride themselves on being the toughest fighters among the greenskins, and their boys are generally bigger and more aggressive than those of other clans. Against most opponents, this would be a decisive advantage. Against the Krork Ogryns, it simply meant that the fights were louder and the bodies were bigger. The defense of the Volcanus Southern Gate is often cited as one of the defining engagements of the Third War. A massive column of Goth Orks, led by a war boss known as Grimjaw the Unbreakable, launched a sustained assault on the gate lasting 3 full days and nights. The Imperial defenders included elements of the Armageddon Steel Legion, supported by a full company of Krork Ogryn Auxilia and a detachment of Bullgryns equipped with slab shields and power mauls. The Bullgryn detachment was positioned at the gate itself, their slab shields forming an interlocking wall across the entrance that turned the gateway into a killing ground. As the Orks charged, the Bullgryns absorbed the impact of the first wave with their shields, then counterattacked with their power mauls, each blow sending Ork bodies flying like dolls. Behind the Bullgryns, the standard Ogryn Auxilia poured fire into the packed Ork ranks with their Ripper guns, the heavy weapons tearing through greenskin flesh with mechanical regularity. And behind them, the Steel Legion guardsmen added their laser guns and heavy weapons to the firestorm, creating a layered defense that the Orks could not penetrate no matter how many bodies they threw at it. Grimjaw himself was killed on the second day, his skull crushed by a Bullgryn power maul when he attempted to break through the shield wall by personal force. His death should have broken the Ork assault, and for a time it did. The greenskins fell back, milling about in confusion as the sudden power vacuum triggered exactly the kind of leadership crisis that we discussed earlier. Knobs fought each other for the right to take command. Mobs that had been advancing in coordination suddenly broke apart into squabbling groups. The entire Ork column, which had been a formidable military force just minutes earlier, degenerated into a chaotic mess of infighting and confusion. And this is where the Orks' organizational weakness becomes most apparent. It took the Orks nearly 6 hours to sort out their leadership dispute, during which time the Imperial defenders were able to reinforce their positions, evacuate their wounded, resupply their ammunition, and prepare for the next assault. 6 hours of free breathing room, handed to the defenders by the Orks' own inability to maintain unit cohesion in the absence of a strong central leader. The Ogryns, during those same 6 hours, simply stood at their posts and waited for the next attack, at their discipline and their obedience, providing a stability that the Orks could not match and could not overcome. The Third War for Armageddon dragged on for years, eventually becoming a grinding war of attrition that consumed millions of lives on both sides. The Orks, with their spore-based reproduction, were able to replenish their losses at a rate that the Imperium could not match, and the war eventually settled into a stalemate that persisted for decades. But throughout the entire conflict, the Ogryn auxiliary units consistently performed at levels that exceeded expectations, holding positions that human units could not hold, breaking charges that human units could not break, and providing a backbone of raw physical power and unwavering determination that kept the Imperial defense from collapsing entirely. Let me now talk in more depth about the weapons that Ogryns carry into battle, because the equipment that a soldier carries is a crucial factor in determining their battlefield effectiveness, and the comparison between Ogryn weapons and Ork weapons reveals yet another dimension of the argument in the Ogryns' favor. The signature weapon of the Ogryn is the Ripper gun, and it is one of the most brutally practical weapons in the entire Astra Militarum arsenal. The Ripper gun is, at its core, a very large, very heavy automatic shotgun that has been designed specifically for Ogryn use. It fires a drum magazine of solid slugs that can punch through light armor and turn unarmored targets into something that barely qualifies as a memory. The weapon is built with a level of ruggedness that borders on the absurd, constructed from heavy gauge metal and designed to withstand the kind of abuse that only an Ogryn can inflict on its own equipment. Because Ogryns break things. That is just what they do. They do not mean to, usually, but their enormous strength and their somewhat clumsy grip means that any weapon they carry needs to be built to survive being dropped, thrown, stepped on, used as a club, used as a lever, used as a chair, and occasionally used as a projectile when the ammunition runs out. The Ripper gun addresses all of these challenges with elegant simplicity. It has no delicate components. It has no sophisticated targeting systems. It has no fancy electronics or fragile optical sights. It is, essentially, a metal tube with a mechanism that makes big metal slugs come out of the front at high speed. An Ogryn can learn to operate a Ripper gun in minutes. An Ogryn can maintain a Ripper gun with no tools and minimal supervision. An Ogryn can take a Ripper gun apart and put it back together in the dark, in the rain, in the middle of a firefight, with both hands covered in blood and grease and the remains of whatever the Ogryn ate for breakfast. This reliability and simplicity of operation is a massive tactical advantage, because a weapon that a soldier cannot use or cannot maintain is worse than no weapon at all. The Ripper gun also features a built-in bayonet blade, transforming it into a brutally effective close combat weapon. When an Ogryn charges into melee, swinging a Ripper gun by the barrel, the bayonet blade adds a cutting edge to what is already a devastating impact weapon. The combined effect is something like being hit simultaneously by a sledgehammer and a machete, and the results are exactly as messy as you might imagine. Bullgryns, the heavy infantry variant of the standard Ogryn, carry an even more impressive array of weaponry. The Grenadier Gauntlet is a forearm-mounted grenade launcher that fires fragmentation grenades with impressive accuracy, allowing the Bullgryn to lay down suppressive fire while closing to melee range. The Power Maul is a crackling energy weapon that disrupts molecular bonds on contact, allowing the Bullgryn to smash through armor, fortifications, and enemy bodies with equal ease. And the Bullgryn's shield options, either the massive slab shield or the smaller brute shield with its integrated energy field, and provide a level of personal protection that turns these already formidable creatures into walking bunkers. Compare this to the weapons that orcs carry. Orc weaponry, known collectively as orky gubbins, or simply shooters and choppers, is assembled by mech boys from whatever scrap metal and salvaged components happen to be available. The quality of these weapons varies wildly, from barely functional hunks of metal that are as likely to blow up in the user's hands as they are to hit the target, to surprisingly sophisticated devices that incorporate advanced technology looted from more developed civilizations. The average orc shooter is a crude automatic weapon that fires large caliber rounds at a high rate but with terrible accuracy. It works, after a fashion, because the orc gestalt psychic field ensures that orc technology functions even when it logically should not. But its performance is inconsistent and its maintenance requirements are unpredictable. The orc chopper, the standard close combat weapon of the orc boy, is essentially a large, heavy blade made from whatever metal the mech boy had on hand. Some are jagged and crude, little better than sharpened scrap. Others are more refined, incorporating power fields or unusual materials that give them enhanced cutting ability. But again, the quality varies enormously from one weapon to the next, and there is no standardization, no quality control, and no guarantee that any given chopper will perform the same way twice. This inconsistency is a direct consequence of the orc approach to technology, which is based on intuition and gestalt psychic influence, rather than engineering principles and quality assurance. An orc mech boy does not design a weapon. It builds one, following instincts encoded in its DNA by the old ones, using whatever materials are to hand, and relying on the collective psychic field of its species to fill in any gaps in functionality. The result is technology that works, sort of, most of the time. But that is fundamentally unreliable in a way that Imperial technology, for all its many quirks and limitations, is not. The Ogryns Ripper gun will fire every time the trigger is pulled, barring catastrophic mechanical failure. It will hit roughly where it is pointed. It will deliver a consistent level of damage with every round. These are basic qualities that any soldier should be able to expect from their weapon. But they are qualities that orc weapons often fail to provide. In a sustained engagement, where the outcome depends on the ability to deliver consistent, reliable firepower over an extended period, the Ogryns' standardized Imperial weaponry provides a clear and significant advantage over the orcs' unpredictable collection of jury-rigged death traps. But the weapons comparison goes deeper than just reliability. The Imperium's approach to arming its Ogryn forces reflects a broader philosophy of military logistics that is fundamentally more sustainable than the orc model. Every Ripper gun is manufactured to a standardized pattern by Forge Worlds, whose production lines have been optimized over thousands of years. Every round of ammunition is produced to consistent specifications that guarantee reliable performance. Every piece of Ogryn equipment, from their flak armor to their combat boots, is designed to work together as an integrated system, each component supporting and complementing the others. The orcs have nothing comparable. Their weapons are one-offs, built by individual mechboys for individual users, with no two exactly alike. Their ammunition is often hand-loaded, using propellant charges of inconsistent quality that produce unpredictable muzzle velocities and trajectories. Their armor, such as it exists, is cobbled together from scrap metal, looted equipment, and whatever else happens to be lying around. There is no supply chain, no standardization, no logistical infrastructure supporting the individual orc warrior. Each one is essentially a self-contained unit, armed and equipped with whatever it can scrounge, build, or steal. This model works in a chaotic and inefficient fashion when the orcs have the initiative and access to plentiful loot. But when supply lines are cut, when loot is scarce, when the orcs are forced onto the defensive, the lack of logistical infrastructure becomes a critical weakness. Orcs cannot resupply from a centralized depot. They cannot request replacement weapons through a standardized requisition process. They cannot draw on the stockpiles of a Forge world thousands of light years away. They have what they have, and when it breaks or runs out, they have nothing. The Ogryns, embedded in the Astra Militarum's logistical network, never face this problem. Their weapons are maintained by Departamento Munitorum armorers. Their ammunition is delivered by Departamento Munitorum supply convoys. But their armor is repaired by Departamento Munitorum artificers. The Ogryn does not need to worry about where its next meal or its next magazine of ammunition is coming from, because the vast, creaking, agonizingly slow but ultimately functional machinery of Imperial logistics handles all of that on its behalf. It is not a glamorous advantage. It is not the kind of thing that makes for exciting stories or dramatic last stands. But it is the kind of advantage that wins wars, because wars are won not by the side that fights hardest, but by the side that can keep fighting longest. There is one more battlefield scenario I want to describe before we move on, because it illustrates a capability of the Ogryns that is often overlooked: their effectiveness as a psychological weapon. Well, the mere presence of Ogryns on a battlefield has a measurable impact on the morale of both friendly and enemy forces. On the friendly side, the sight of Ogryns advancing alongside you, their enormous bulk absorbing fire, and their booming voices bellowing encouragement, provides a morale boost that is difficult to quantify but impossible to deny. Human soldiers fight harder, hold longer, and recover faster from setbacks when they know that the Ogryns are with them. On the enemy side, the psychological impact is equally significant, though it manifests differently depending on the opponent. Against human enemies, such as rebels, cultists, or traitorous guard regiments, the appearance of Ogryns on the battlefield can be outright terrifying. These are creatures that stand 10 feet tall and weigh 1,000 kilograms. As creatures that can absorb lasgun's fire without flinching and crush a man's skull with a casual backhand. The intimidation factor alone can break enemy formations, causing panic and rout before the Ogryns even make contact. Against Orks, the psychological dynamic is different, but still favorable. Orks respect strength. They admire size, and when they see an Ogryn bearing down on them, a creature that is bigger and stronger and tougher than most of them, some instinctive part of the greenskin brain recognizes a superior physical specimen and hesitates. Not for long, and not all of them, but enough to create a momentary disruption in the Ork advance that a skilled commander can exploit. Yes, it is well documented in the lore that Nork Dedog's headbutt kill of an Ork warboss left the remaining Orks so awestruck that they retreated rather than face him. That is not a common response among Orks, who typically fight to the death. The fact that a single Ogryn could inspire that reaction speaks to the profound psychological impact that these creatures can have on even the most battle-hardened opponents. There is also the matter of what happens in void warfare, in the boarding actions and space hulk clearance operations that are an essential part of combat in the 41st millennium. In these environments, where the fighting takes place in the cramped corridors and dark chambers of starships and ancient derelict vessels, the Ogryn's strengths are amplified to an almost absurd degree. And a corridor that might be wide enough for 2 or 3 human soldiers to advance abreast is barely wide enough for a single Ogryn, which means that the Ogryn effectively becomes a living plug, blocking the entire passageway with its body and making it impossible for the enemy to advance until the Ogryn is removed. And removing an Ogryn is, as we have established, a task that requires a level of firepower and determination that many opponents simply cannot muster. During the boarding of space hulks, Ogryns have proven themselves to be invaluable assets, their enormous strength allowing them to force open sealed bulkheads, clear blocked passages, and physically tear through obstacles that would stop lighter troops cold. Their resistance to the psychological effects of operating in the dark, confined, and often deeply unsettling environments found inside space hulks is another advantage. While human soldiers may succumb to claustrophobia, paranoia, or the subtle psychic influences that permeate many hulks, Ogryns are largely immune to such effects. Their minds are too simple, too focused on the immediate and the concrete, to be affected by abstract fears or subtle psychological manipulation. You cannot scare an Ogryn with creepy noises or unsettling architecture. You can only scare an Ogryn by threatening the people it cares about, and even then, The fear manifests not as paralysis, but as redoubled aggression. Speaking of the Ogryns' relationship with the forces of chaos, this is another area where the species demonstrates a surprising advantage. In the grimdark universe of 40,000, as where the corrupting influence of the warp is an ever-present threat to every living being, the Ogryns' psychological simplicity serves as a form of natural protection against chaos corruption. The dark gods of the warp prey on the complex emotions and desires of sentient beings, on ambition, on pride, on fear, on the hunger for power and knowledge. They twist these desires into pathways for corruption, warping the minds and bodies of those who fall under their influence. Ogryns, by and large, are immune to this, not because they are spiritually pure in some abstract theological sense, but because they simply do not have the psychological complexity that the ruinous powers need to gain a foothold. You cannot tempt an Ogryn with promises of power, because an Ogryn does not understand power. You cannot tempt it with knowledge, because it does not care about knowledge. You cannot tempt it with glory, because it does not know what glory is. The only things an Ogryn wants are food, companionship, and the approval of its emperor, and the Chaos Gods have historically found these desires too simple and too pure to corrupt. There are exceptions, of course. The plague Ogryns of Vrax demonstrate that Ogryns can be corrupted by chaos, but significantly, this corruption typically requires direct physical transformation by Chaos Space Marines or other powerful agents of the warp, rather than the subtle psychological seduction that claims most human victims. The Ogryns did not choose to serve chaos. They were physically mutated against their will, transformed into bloated, diseased monstrosities by the foul powers of Nurgle. This is a fundamentally different process from the gradual corruption that claims human servants of chaos, and it underscores the point that the Ogryns' psychological simplicity provides a genuine defense against one of the most dangerous threats in the galaxy. During the Horus Heresy, the greatest civil war in human history, Ogryns fought on both sides of the conflict. But the lore makes a crucial point about why some Ogryns ended up fighting for the traitors. They were lied to. The traitor forces, knowing that they could not corrupt the Ogryns through conventional means, simply told them that they were still fighting for the Emperor and that the loyalists were the real traitors. The Ogryns, trusting their officers as they always did, believed them and fought accordingly. This is simultaneously heartbreaking and deeply revealing. Yet the Ogryns were not corrupted. They were deceived. And the distinction matters because it means that the Ogryns' fundamental nature, its loyalty and its love for the Emperor, remained intact even in the worst circumstances imaginable. They never turned traitor. They were turned. Contrast this with the Orks, who have no vulnerability to chaos corruption at all, not because of any psychological resilience, but because they are Xenos, whose minds simply do not interface with the warp in the way that human minds do. The Orcs' immunity to chaos is a biological fact, not a testament to their character. It says nothing about their values or their nature, only about the mechanics of their psychic gestalt. The Ogryns' resistance, by contrast, is rooted in something deeper, in a purity of purpose and a simplicity of desire that even the thirsting gods cannot pervert. Now let me tell you about some specific Ogryns, some individuals whose stories illuminate the qualities that make this species so remarkable, so underappreciated, and ultimately so much more valuable than the green hordes they are so often compared to. We have already spoken of Nork Dedog, but the full scope of his legend deserves a more thorough examination, because Nork is not just a famous Ogryn. He is arguably one of the most effective soldiers in the entire history of the Astra Militarum, a distinction that is all the more remarkable given that he is, by the standards of his own species, considered a genius for being able to write the letter N and count to 4. But Nork was identified early in his life as possessing unusual cognitive abilities for an Ogryn, and was selected by the Schola Progenium for special duties. He underwent biochemical neural enhancement, the same bone procedure we discussed earlier, and received extensive martial training that honed his already formidable physical abilities to a razor edge. Nork's career as a bodyguard reads like a greatest hits compilation of Imperial heroism. He was assigned to the 2nd Catachan Regiment under Colonel Grice, and from that point on, his sole purpose in life was to keep the colonel alive. This he did with a dedication that would put a custodian to shame. On Breakback Hill, when Grice was badly wounded and the regiment was in full retreat, Nork carried the colonel to safety through hostile territory, dragging the wreckage of the colonel's Chimera transport vehicle behind him as improvised cover while being shot at by thousands of enemy troops. He reportedly felt no pain from the wounds he sustained during this exercise, or if he did, he considered them too unimportant to mention. On another occasion, when Ork warboss Uglurk Gitsmasher and his retinue of meganobs charged an Imperial Guard command dugout, Nork was the only defender who stood his ground. He killed the massive Ork warlord with a single, devastatingly violent headbutt that was delivered with such force that the remaining Orks were left awestruck and retreated rather than face the angry Ogryn. Think about that for a moment. A single Ogryn, armed with nothing but his own skull, killed an Ork warboss in full mega armor and scared the rest of the warband into running away. No power claw, no bolter round, just forehead meeting face at high velocity, and the warboss was done. Over the course of his career, Nork has saved the lives of well over 100 officers, earning himself a chest full of medals that he wears with a pride that is both touching and slightly absurd, given that he probably does not understand what most of them are for. He has been described as the finest bodyguard in the entire Astra Militarum, and there are few who would dispute that claim. His combination of physical power, enhanced cognitive ability, and absolute, unwavering loyalty to whatever officer he has been assigned to protect makes him an almost perfect embodiment of everything that the Ogryn species represents. But Nork is not the only Ogryn whose story deserves to be told. There is Urok, who served with the 233rd Catachan Jungle Fighters, one of the most elite and dangerous human regiments in the entire Astra Militarum. Urok was tithed at a very young age and grew up alongside the Catachans, developing a bond with his human comrades that was as deep and as genuine as anything in the lore of the 41st Millennium. He was particularly close to an old Catachan named Gurion, and when Gurion was killed by Ork boys during an assault, Urok's grief and rage were terrible to behold. The loss of his friend did not break Urok's spirit, it strengthened it. He became, if anything, even more fiercely protective of his remaining comrades, even more determined to keep them alive, even more willing to put his own enormous body between them and whatever the galaxy threw at them. There is also the story of Tig, the Ogryn who features in the Darktide short story, whose tale paints a deeply moving portrait of an Ogryn's interior life. Tig is described as a big, clumsy mountain of muscle, who lacked knowledge and social grace, but made up for it with single-minded determination, unwavering loyalty, and boundless energy. The story describes how the squad initially accepted his company reluctantly, but his endless childlike enthusiasm and relentless optimism wore them down until none of them could recall the team without him. When his friend Keren was killed, Tig's face was distorted more than usual, the heavy brow twisted into an expression of abject misery. And yet, when asked if he was ready to fight, Tig brightened immediately, his willingness to die in service to the Emperor described as, in no small way, utterly heartbreaking. These stories matter because they reveal something that the dry, tactical assessments and statistical comparisons often miss. The human dimension of the Ogryn. Yes, they are weapons. Yes, they are tools of war. Yes, they are deployed by the Imperium in much the same way that a craftsman might use a hammer, pointed at a problem and applied with force until the problem goes away. But they are also people. Dim-witted, unsophisticated, occasionally catastrophically smelly people, but people nonetheless. They form bonds. They grieve their losses. They take pride in their service. They love. And in a galaxy that is defined by its cruelty, its indifference, and its relentless grinding down of everything that makes existence bearable, the Ogryns' capacity for love is not just admirable, it is heroic. The Orks have their legends too, of course, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. Gazkul Mag Uruk Thraka, the self-proclaimed prophet of Gork and Mork, the beast of Armageddon, is one of the most storied and feared figures in the entire galaxy. His campaigns against the Imperium, particularly the Second and Third Wars for Armageddon, rank among the largest and most devastating conflicts of the 41st millennium. He has fought Space Marines, Imperial Guard, Tyranids, and even other Orks, and he has emerged from every engagement more powerful and more dangerous than before. His vision of a galaxy-spanning Green Crusade, a stampeding march of conquest so vast that it draws the very gods of the Orks into real space to join the fight, is one of the most ambitious and terrifying plans in the history of warfare. But Gazkul's story also illustrates the fundamental weakness of the Ork model. His rise to power was triggered by a near-fatal head wound, a bolter round that blew off roughly 30% of his skull and required emergency surgery by a mad doc to save his life. The adamantium plating that replaced the lost portion of his cranium, combined with the head trauma itself, triggered visions that Gazgakul interpreted as messages from Gork and Mork. Whether these visions are genuinely divine, the product of brain damage, or some combination of both, is a question that no one in the lore has been able to answer definitively. But regardless of their origin, the visions are what drive Gazgakul, what give him his sense of purpose and his conviction that he is destined for greatness. And therein lies the problem. Gazgakul is not a leader in the way that a human or even an Ogryn understands the word. He is a force of nature, a walking catastrophe that drags other Orks along in his wake through sheer gravitational pull. He does not inspire loyalty. He demands obedience. He does not build institutions or train successors or create structures that can survive his absence. He is the Horde, and the Horde is him. And when he eventually falls, as all Orks eventually do, the whole edifice will collapse into the same chaotic infighting that has been the doom of every Ork empire since the War in Heaven. Compare this to the structures that the Imperium has built around its Ogryn forces. The Militarum Auxilia, the specialist division of the Astra Militarum that contains most of the abhuman units employed by the Imperium. It provides a framework within which Ogryns can be recruited, trained, equipped, and deployed with remarkable efficiency. Ogryn units are not raised as independent regiments like other Imperial Guard forces. Instead, they are attached to existing regiments of other worlds, integrated into the larger military structure in a way that maximizes their strengths while compensating for their weaknesses. This system has been refined over thousands of years, and it works. Ogryn units consistently perform at or above the expectations set for them, and their presence in a regiment reliably improves the morale and combat effectiveness of the human soldiers they serve alongside. There are notable Ogryn regiments that have carved their names into the annals of Imperial military history. The Kruok Ogryn Auxilia, famous for their warlike culture and their ferocious fighting spirit, have served with distinction in countless campaigns. The Monglor Ogryn Auxilia, who served at the Battle of Hell's Reach on Armageddon, demonstrated great valor and force of arms, despite the fact that a significant portion of the Ogryn population on their homeworld had recently rebelled against the Imperium. The loyalty of the Monglor, who remained faithful, was tested in the fires of one of the most brutal urban battles in recent Imperial history, and they passed that test with flying colors. It is worth noting here that the classification of Ogryns is itself a fascinating subject that speaks to the diversity and adaptability of the species. The Administratum's Tithes Chamber Notaries currently recognizes 7 distinct subtypes of Ogryn: Alpha, Theta, Type 4, Type 7a, Homo sapiens gigantus gigantus, Homo sapiens gigantus cranopus, and the mysterious grey Ogryns about whom almost nothing is known. This classification system is, by the Administratum's own admission, a mess. Many within the department believe that these classifications are not properly aligned, that some types that are currently grouped together should be separated, and that the entire matrix of Ogryn strains requires a major revision. But the very existence of this diversity tells us something important about the Ogryn species. It is not a monolith. It is a varied, complex, and still evolving family of subspecies, each adapted to the particular conditions of its homeworld, each bringing its own unique characteristics to the table. The feral Ogryns are a particularly interesting case. These are Ogryns from worlds so primitive and so isolated that their populations have developed a culture that many observers describe as being little better than that of the Orks. They do not respond to conventional training. They cannot be taught to use ripper guns or follow the chain of command. But their raw combat ability is extraordinary, and the Imperium has learned to put it to use. When a crisis demands immediate, overwhelming close combat power, and there is no time for the niceties of training and indoctrination, landing parties will descend upon these feral worlds, capture several tribes, and bring them to the battlefield. The sight of a mob of feral Ogryns charging into an enemy formation, armed with crude but devastatingly effective close combat weapons and driven by a primal aggression that has been honed over millennia of survival, is one of the most terrifying spectacles in the Astra Militarum's repertoire. Then there are the Ogryn Charonites, who represent a very different approach to Ogryn warfare. Used during the Great Crusade and the Horus Heresy by the Solar Auxilia, the Charonites were biochemically and cybernetically enhanced Ogryns, whose already formidable combat capabilities were amplified to terrifying levels through a combination of chemical stimulants, neural augmetics, and surgical modifications. These were not the friendly, loyal, slightly dim soldiers that most people think of when they picture an Ogryn. These were weapons of last resort, combat monsters that were unleashed against enemies too powerful for conventional forces to handle, and then, if they survived, carefully restrained and controlled until the next time they were needed. The existence of the Charonites demonstrates something important about the Ogryn species. Its potential is far greater than the current deployment model suggests. The Imperium uses Ogryns primarily as simple shock troops, pointing them at the enemy and letting their natural strength and loyalty do the rest. But the Charonites showed that with the right enhancements and the right support, Ogryns can be transformed into something far more formidable, a tier of warrior that sits somewhere between a standard guardsman and a space marine in terms of raw combat power. Thus, the fact that the Imperium has not pursued this potential more aggressively in the millennia since the Horus Heresy is one of the great missed opportunities of Imperial military history. Now, the Ork side of the organizational comparison is worth examining in detail as well, because the Ork clan system is one of the most distinctive and influential aspects of greenskin culture, and it shapes the way that Ork forces operate on the battlefield, in ways that have direct implications for our comparison. The 6 major Ork clans, the Goths, the Bad Moons, the Evil Sons, the Death Skulls, the Blood Axes, and the Snakebites, represent different philosophical approaches to the business of being an Ork, and each one brings different strengths and weaknesses to the table. The Goths are the most combat-focused, preferring close-quarters fighting and fielding vast mobs of infantry. The Bad Moons are the wealthiest, their teeth growing faster than those of other clans, giving them access to the best equipment and the flashiest weapons. The Evil Sons are speed-obsessed, painting their vehicles red in the belief that this makes them go faster, which, because of the Gestalt psychic field, it actually does. The Death Skulls are scavengers and looters, skilled at repurposing enemy technology for their own use. The Blood Axes are the most tactically sophisticated, willing to use strategies like ambushes and retreats that other Orks would consider cowardly. And the Snakebites are the most traditional, eschewing technology in favor of beasts and brute strength. This diversity gives the Orks a degree of tactical flexibility that is often underappreciated. And a mixed clan Ork force can combine the Goths' close combat power with the Evil Sons' speed, the Bad Moon's firepower, and the Blood Axe's tactical cunning creating a force that is far more versatile than the sum of its parts. But this diversity also creates friction. The clans do not always get along. Their different philosophies and priorities often lead to internal conflict, with mobs from different clans fighting each other over loot, territory, or simply differences of opinion about the best way to crump the enemy. This internal friction is a constant drain on the Orcs' combat effectiveness, and it gets worse the longer a campaign goes on and the more clans are involved. The Ogryns have no equivalent of the clan system. Every Ogryn squad is organized along the same lines, with the same equipment, the same command structure, and the same tactical doctrine. This uniformity might seem like a weakness compared to the Orcs' diversity, but in practice, it is a significant strength. Uniformity means predictability, and predictability means that Imperial commanders know exactly what they are getting when they deploy an Ogryn unit. There are no surprises, no unexpected behaviors, no internal conflicts to manage. Every Ogryn squad performs the same way, every time, in every situation. This makes them easy to integrate into battle plans, easy to coordinate with other units, and easy to rely on. These are not the stories of individual heroes, though individual heroes emerge from them. These are the stories of institutions, of structures, of systems that work. And that, ultimately, is what separates the Ogryn from the Orc in the arena of military effectiveness. The Orc is a brilliant weapon with no safety catch, a fire that burns hot and bright and then goes out. The Ogryn is a reliable tool, a foundation stone, an asset that can be counted on to perform its function day after day, year after year, campaign after campaign, with a consistency that the Orcs could never match and could never even understand. Let us now address the elephant in the room, or perhaps I should say the fungoid in the room, the Orc reproductive advantage. I mentioned earlier that the Orcs reproduce through spores, and I acknowledged that this gives them an enormous numerical advantage over the Ogryns and, frankly, over just about every other species in the galaxy. The scale of the Orc population is almost beyond comprehension. They are the most numerous species in the galaxy, more numerous even than humanity, and their ability to replenish their numbers from the ground itself makes them a threat that cannot be permanently eliminated through conventional means. You can kill every Orc on a planet, and they will come back, grown from the spores that their predecessors left behind. You can burn the surface clean with orbital bombardment, and they will still come back, because the spores can survive underground, dormant, for decades or even centuries. This is a genuine and significant advantage, and there is no point in pretending otherwise. In a straight numbers game, the Orcs win. They will always win the numbers game. There are simply too many of them, and they reproduce too quickly, and their biological infrastructure is too resilient to be overcome by attrition alone. But numbers are not everything. In fact, and in the specific context of military effectiveness, numbers can sometimes be a liability. The Orcs' vast population creates logistical challenges that their ramshackle civilizations are ill-equipped to handle. Feeding, arming, and transporting millions of Orcs requires resources on a scale that most Orc empires cannot sustain for long, which is one of the reasons why Orc stampeding crusades tend to burn themselves out after a certain point. The horde grows so large that it cannot feed itself, and the Orcs at the back start fighting the Orcs at the front over food and loot and the best spots to sleep, and the whole enterprise collapses under its own weight. The Ogryns do not have this problem, because they are integrated into the logistical framework of the Astra Militarum, which, for all its many flaws and inefficiencies, and is one of the most sophisticated military supply systems in the galaxy. An Ogryn regiment is fed, armed, transported, and maintained by the same infrastructure that supports the rest of the Imperial Guard, which means that its soldiers are always equipped, always supplied, and always ready for action. The Ogryn does not have to scavenge for weapons or fight over food. It has everything it needs provided for it, courtesy of a military machine that has been feeding armies for 10,000 years. There is also the matter of what happens when the fighting is over. When an orc horde is defeated, it does not simply go away. It leaves behind spores, the seeds of future infestations that can take decades or even centuries to fully manifest. This means that every orc invasion creates a long-term problem that persists long after the immediate military threat has been dealt with. Planets that have been invaded by orcs often have to deal with periodic outbreaks of feral orc populations for generations, a constant drain on resources and attention that diverts military assets from other threats. This ecological aftermath is something that deserves more attention than it typically receives, because it transforms what might appear to be a decisive victory into a perpetual commitment of resources. When you defeat an orc invasion, you have not solved a problem. You have merely contained one. The spores are in the soil, in the water table, in the cracks between the stones. They will germinate. They will produce the familiar cascade of lesser organisms first, of the squigs and the snotlings, then the Gretchen, and finally, inevitably, the orcs themselves. Within a generation, the planet will face a new orc threat, this time from within its own borders, and the whole bloody business will have to be done again. The Imperial response to this problem is expensive and never entirely effective. Decontamination teams must be deployed to the affected world, equipped with specialized chemicals and flamer units designed to destroy orc spores in the soil. These teams must work systematically, sector by sector, burning and poisoning the earth to deny the spores the nutrients they need to germinate. The process can take years, and even the most thorough decontamination effort will miss some percentage of the spores, meaning that the risk of future orc outbreaks can never be completely eliminated. Some worlds that have been invaded by orcs are plagued by periodic feral orc incursions for centuries, draining resources that could be better spent fighting the Imperium's countless other enemies. Armageddon itself is a perfect example of this problem. Despite the massive Imperial military presence on the planet, the orc spore infestation from the Second and Third Wars has proven impossible to eradicate. Feral orc tribes continue to emerge from the equatorial jungles and the ash waste caves, attacking settlements and military outposts with regularity. The Imperium has been forced to maintain a permanent garrison on Armageddon specifically to deal with these outbreaks, a garrison that could otherwise be deployed against the Imperium's many other enemies. Whilst the orcs that were defeated in the main battles continue to cost the Imperium resources, manpower, and attention decades after their military threat was supposedly neutralized. There are also the secondary ecological effects to consider. The orc spore ecosystem does not just produce orcs. It produces an entire biological infrastructure of organisms that are, in their own way, as problematic as the orcs themselves. Squigs, the simplest products of the orc spore cycle, come in dozens of varieties, from the face-eating attack squigs that infest tunnels and cave systems, to the hair squigs that orcs attach to their scalps for aesthetic purposes. These creatures are invasive by nature, competing with and often displacing native species in ways that can destabilize entire planetary ecosystems. While worlds that have been invaded by orcs often find their native wildlife decimated by squig infestations, their agricultural systems disrupted by fungal growth, and their water supplies contaminated by the byproducts of orc biological activity. None of these problems are associated with the Ogryns. When an Ogryn regiment completes its mission and departs a world, it takes everything with it. There are no spores, no invasive species, no ecological time bombs waiting to detonate decades down the line. The Ogryns' impact on the worlds they defend is purely positive, limited to the military contribution they make during the battle itself, and the morale boost they provide to the human soldiers who fight alongside them. An Ogryn defends a world, and then leaves it better than it found it, or at least no worse. An orc invades a world and leaves it permanently scarred, ecologically compromised, and burdened with a problem that may never be fully resolved. This is, admittedly, not a fair comparison in one sense. The Ogryns are defenders, not invaders, and the ecological damage caused by an orc invasion is a consequence of the invasion itself, rather than any inherent flaw in the orc as a soldier. But it is a relevant comparison in the broader context of military value, because the true cost of a military force is not just the cost of deploying it, but the cost of dealing with the consequences of its deployment. And by that measure, the Ogryn is dramatically cheaper than the orc, because the Ogryn creates no consequences that need to be dealt with after the fighting stops. Ogryns, by contrast, leave nothing behind but gratitude. Or when an Ogryn regiment departs a planet, it takes everything with it, including its wounded and its dead. There are no spores, no hidden infestations, no time-delayed surprises waiting to pop up 20 years later. The problem the Ogryns were brought in to solve is solved, and the planet can move on with its life. This is a mundane advantage, perhaps, not the kind of thing that makes for exciting stories or dramatic last stands. But it is an important one, because in the long game of galactic survival, where every resource counts and every diversion is potentially fatal, the ability to solve a problem completely without creating new problems in the process is worth more than all the numbers in the galaxy. Let us also talk about what the Orcs' internal dynamics really look like, because the reality is far messier and far less effective than the popular image of the unstoppable green tide might suggest. Orc society is, at every level, based on violence. This is not an exaggeration or a simplification. It is a literal description of how Orc society functions. Leadership is determined by who can beat whom in a fight. Disputes are settled through combat. Resources are allocated based on who is strong enough to take them. Laws, such as they exist, are enforced through the immediate application of physical force. This creates a society that is spectacularly good at producing fighters, but terrible at everything else. There is no orc diplomacy, no orc commerce, no orc art or culture or science in any meaningful sense. There is only fighting, and the preparation for fighting, and the recovery from fighting, and the fighting that happens during the recovery from fighting. The orcs are a one-note species, and while that one note is played with tremendous enthusiasm and impressive volume, it cannot sustain a civilization. More importantly, the violence-based social structure creates chronic instability that undermines the orcs' military effectiveness. Every orc horde carries within itself the seeds of its own destruction, because every nob is a potential rival to the war boss, and every boy is a potential rival to his nob, and the moment the pressure of an external threat is removed, all of these rivalries come roaring to the surface. This is why orc stampeding crusades stall. This is why orc empires crumble. This is why the orcs, despite being the most numerous and one of the most physically powerful species in the galaxy, have never managed to conquer it. The Ogryns have none of these problems. Their social structure within the Astra Militarum is based on clear, stable hierarchies that are maintained not through violence, but through trust and mutual obligation. The Bonehead leads the squad because the Bonehead is smarter, not because the Bonehead is bigger. The human officer commands the Ogryns because the Ogryns trust the human officer, not because the human officer can beat them in a fight, because obviously no human officer could beat an Ogryn in a fight, and the Ogryns know this perfectly well. The entire system works because it is built on a foundation of loyalty rather than a foundation of violence. And loyalty, unlike violence, does not turn on itself the moment the external pressure is relieved. I want to spend some time now talking about Ogryns in the broader context of Warhammer 40,000's popular culture, because the way that the community has embraced these hulking abhumans says something important about what makes them special. In the tabletop game, Ogryns and Bullgryns occupy a unique niche within the Astra Militarum army. They are the guard's answer to the question of what to do when the enemy gets too close for lasgun fire and too tough for bayonets. A squad of Bullgryns with slab shields, advancing in formation with human infantry sheltering behind them, is one of the most visually striking and tactically interesting units in the entire game. Their wall of muscle ability which reduces the damage of every attack allocated to them, makes them extraordinarily durable, especially when combined with the various defensive buffs available to Astra Militarum characters and stratagems. A 6-model squad of Ogryns with brute shields and their built-in damage reduction can become nearly impossible to shift from an objective, soaking up fire that would annihilate any other unit in the army and refusing to budge. On the tabletop, Nork Deadog himself is available as a unique character, a bodyguard whose thunderous headbutt rule lets him headbutt enemy units into submission and whose Ogryn bodyguard ability grants the officer he is protecting a feel no pain, save that represents him physically interposing his massive body between his charge and incoming fire. It is a beautifully simple set of rules that captures the essence of what Nork is, a big, loyal, an incredibly tough lump of muscle whose sole purpose in life is to make sure his boss does not die. But it is in the world of video games, specifically in Warhammer 40,000, Darktide, that Ogryns have truly captured the hearts of the fan community. Darktide, developed by Fatshark, is a cooperative first-person shooter that puts players in the boots of a strike team operating on the hive world of Tertium, battling the forces of chaos in claustrophobic corridors and sprawling industrial landscapes. One of the 4 playable classes in Darktide is the Ogryn, and it is, by a significant margin, the most beloved character class in the game. Playing as the Ogryn in Darktide is an experience unlike anything else in the game. You are enormous, towering over your human teammates and taking up what feels like half the corridor. You are armed with weapons that are comically oversized, from the Ripper Gun to the Grenadier Gauntlet to the appropriately named Latrine Shovel, which is exactly what it sounds like and exactly as entertaining to use as you might imagine. You are slow, but unstoppable, wading through hordes of enemies with a cheerful disregard for personal safety that is both hilarious and deeply endearing. But it is the Ogryns' voice lines and personality that have truly won the community over. The Ogryn in Darktide is not just a combat class, it is a character, a fully realized individual with hopes and fears, and a personality that manages to be simultaneously hilarious, heartbreaking, and genuinely lovable. The Ogryn talks about the Emperor with a reverence that is both childlike and deeply sincere, as it refers to its human teammates as little uns and friends, with a warmth that cuts through the bleakness of the setting like a ray of sunshine. It gets confused by big words and complex instructions but tries its best anyway, and its constant, earnest desire to help, to protect, and to make the Emperor proud is one of the most genuinely touching characterizations in any Warhammer 40,000 property. The community response to the Darktide Ogryn has been overwhelmingly positive. Fan art, stories, memes, and discussions about the Ogryn character dominate Darktide community spaces, and the consensus is clear. The Ogryn is the heart of the game. Not the coolest character, not the most powerful character, not the most strategically interesting character, but the one that people care about the most, the one that makes them smile, and the one that reminds them that even in the grim darkness of the far future, there is still room for kindness and loyalty and love. The interactions between the Ogryn and the other classes in Darktide are particularly telling. The veterans, hardened soldiers who have seen the worst the galaxy has to offer, develop a genuine protective instinct toward the Ogryn, defending it against the suggestion that abhumans do not have souls. None of the veteran personalities agree with that assertion. Some deny it vehemently. Others express the hope that even if it were true, the Emperor would be capable of granting souls to creatures so devoted to his service. The Zealots, who by the tenets of the Imperial cult should view abhumans with suspicion and hostility, they often find themselves unable to maintain that stance in the face of the Ogryn's earnest devotion and cheerful good nature. The bodyguard personality type in Darktide lives up to his name by being fiercely protective of his teammates regardless of their background. He may comment on how he has come to view his allies as a sort of family, messy and rowdy and probably insane, but family nonetheless. There is a conversation between the brawler Ogryn and the cutthroat veteran, where the veteran unconvincingly insists that he does not like the Ogryn, but respects his combat prowess and loyalty. The brawler replies that he likes the cutthroat anyway. It is a tiny moment, a throwaway bit of ambient dialogue in a game that is primarily about shooting things, but it captures something essential about what makes Ogryns special. Yet they love unconditionally. They accept without judgment. They offer loyalty without expecting anything in return, except the opportunity to keep fighting for the people they care about. The game also captured the Ogryns' intellectual limitations with a warmth and humor that avoids cruelty. During loading screens, the Ogryn can be seen struggling to count past 4 on his fingers, a detail that could easily be played for mean-spirited laughs, but instead comes across as endearing. The Ogryn voice lines include moments of confusion when confronted with complex vocabulary, asking what consolidate means with a genuine desire to understand rather than a defeated acknowledgement of stupidity. These are the touches that make the Darktide Ogryn feel like a real character rather than a one-note joke, and they are a major reason why the community has embraced the class so enthusiastically. Beyond Darktide, Ogryns have appeared in numerous novels, short stories, and other media set in the Warhammer 40,000 universe, and their portrayal has become increasingly sympathetic and nuanced over the years. The earlier depictions of Ogryns tended to be purely comedic, playing their stupidity for laughs and treating them as little more than biological siege engines. But more recent portrayals have added depth and complexity, exploring the inner lives of these creatures and the bonds they form with their human comrades. The novel Spark of Revolution is a particularly noteworthy example, telling the story of an Ogryn slave on Necromunda whose intelligence is dramatically enhanced by a particularly effective bone implant. This character goes from the stereotypical dim-witted brute to something approaching baseline human intelligence, and the story explores what that transformation means for his identity, his relationships, and his understanding of the world around him. It is a story that challenges the assumption that Ogryns are simply dumb, suggesting instead that their intellectual limitations are a product of their environment and their adaptation, rather than any fundamental deficiency of their species. There is also the interesting case of Cassia, a penal legion Ogryn who displayed psychic abilities in battle following the opening of the Great Rift. Cassia's case is significant for several reasons. First, it challenged the long-held Imperial cult doctrine that Ogryns are incapable of becoming psykers. Second, Cassia's psychic awakening was accompanied by an increase in her intellectual abilities, suggesting a connection between psychic power and cognitive capacity that has profound implications for our understanding of the species. Cassia taught herself to read and write, abilities that the Imperial cult insists Ogryns are incapable of developing. The Inquisitor who recruited her into his retinue believes that the Great Rift may cause many more Ogryns to develop psychic abilities, a prospect that, if true, could fundamentally alter the role that Ogryns play in Imperial warfare. Let me also spend some time on the Ogryn homeworlds themselves, because they are fascinating environments that tell us a great deal about the species that evolved on them. These are not comfortable places. They are not worlds that any sensible human would choose to live on if given the option. They are cold, they are barren, they are relentlessly, brutally hostile to life. The gravity alone would crush a baseline human, pressing down on their bones and muscles with a force that would leave them barely able to walk, let alone fight. The temperatures can drop to levels that would freeze exposed human flesh in minutes. The atmosphere is thin and bitter, laced with particulates and trace chemicals that would damage human lungs with prolonged exposure. The ecosystems are sparse and dangerous, populated by predators that are themselves adapted to the extreme conditions and that view anything smaller than themselves as food. And yet, life flourished on these worlds. Not elegant, refined, civilized life, but tough, stubborn, impossibly resilient life that refused to die no matter what the universe threw at it. The proto-Ogryns, who were stranded on these worlds during the Age of Strife, did not have the luxury of philosophical reflection or intellectual development. They had to eat or starve. They had to fight or die. They had to grow strong or be crushed by the very gravity of their world. Every aspect of their evolution was driven by these stark, simple imperatives, and the result was a species that is perfectly adapted to survival in the most unforgiving environments the galaxy has to offer. The social structures that developed on these worlds were simple and direct, based on tribal affiliations and the leadership of the largest and strongest individuals. The Ogryn tribes on worlds like Anarch Zeta and Hrom developed cultures that, while primitive by Imperial standards, were effective at maintaining social cohesion and organizing collective action. The tribes hunted together, fought together, and shared resources, with the largest and most experienced members taking leadership roles not through violence, as in Orc society, but through a combination of physical prowess and demonstrated reliability. When Imperial missionaries first visited these worlds, they found a population that was already predisposed to the kind of hierarchy and obedience that the Imperial cult demanded. The Ogryns' existing social structures, based on following the biggest and the strongest, translated naturally into following the Emperor, who was presented to them as the biggest and the strongest being in existence. The transition from tribal faith to Imperial faith was remarkably smooth, yet precisely because the Ogryn mind does not overthink such things. The Emperor is big, the Emperor is strong, the Emperor tells us what to do through the officers he has placed above us. This makes sense to an Ogryn in a way that the subtleties of Imperial theology never could, and the simplicity of their faith is, paradoxically, its greatest strength. The commissars who work with Ogryn units have developed specific techniques for managing their charges that differ significantly from the methods used with human troops. Where a commissar might motivate a human regiment through a combination of inspiration, intimidation, and the occasional summary execution, an Ogryn unit requires a different approach. Ogryns respond to commissars not because they fear them, but because they respect them. To an Ogryn, the commissar is the closest thing to the Emperor that they will ever see, a figure of authority whose word is law and whose approval is the highest reward that an Ogryn can aspire to. Smart commissars understand this and use it to their advantage, offering praise and approval as motivation rather than threats and punishment. This is not to say that commissars never have to discipline Ogryns. They do, but the discipline is usually for relatively minor infractions. Things like eating supplies that were meant for other units, accidentally breaking equipment through excessive enthusiasm, or getting lost on the way to the front line because they followed an interesting smell instead of their boneheads' directions. The serious disciplinary problems that plague human regiments, desertion, mutiny, cowardice in the face of the enemy, are virtually unknown among Ogryn units. You do not need to worry about an Ogryn running away from a fight. You need to worry about it running toward the wrong fight, or toward a fight that is not happening yet, or through a wall that happened to be in the way. The relationship between Ogryns and the regular human guardsmen they serve alongside is another dimension of the Ogryn experience that deserves exploration. In many regiments, the Ogryns are initially viewed with a mixture of curiosity, amusement, and mild apprehension. Human soldiers who have never served with abhumans before are often startled by the Ogryns' sheer size and their boisterous, sometimes alarming behavior. An Ogryn's enthusiasm for life can be overwhelming, expressed as it often is through shouting, physical contact that borders on the violent, and an insatiable appetite that can strip a mess hall bare in minutes. But over time, as the regiment fights together and the bonds of shared experience begin to form, the attitude toward the Ogryns changes. The human soldiers come to appreciate the Ogryns' unwavering reliability, their cheerful willingness to take on the most dangerous tasks, and their absolute unconditional loyalty to the regiment and its members. The Ogryns, for their part, develop fierce attachments to the humans they serve alongside, referring to them as little uns, with an affection that is as genuine as it is protective. The result is a unit cohesion that transcends the boundaries of species, shares a bond between human and abhuman that is forged in the fires of combat and tempered by the shared experience of surviving together in a galaxy that is trying very hard to kill them both. There are documented cases of Ogryns going to extraordinary lengths to protect individual human soldiers with whom they have formed bonds. In one recorded instance, an Ogryn carried a wounded guardsman for 3 days through enemy territory, refusing to leave his side even when offered the chance to escape on his own. In another, an Ogryn who had lost his entire squad in an ambush fought his way back to the main Imperial line alone, dragging the body of his commanding officer the entire way so that the man could receive a proper burial. These are not the actions of a simple brute or a mindless weapon. These are the actions of a person, someone who cares. He's someone who understands, at least on a fundamental emotional level, what it means to be loyal, to be faithful, and to love. The speech patterns of Ogryns deserve a brief mention as well, because they are both amusing and informative. Ogryns speak in a form of Low Gothic that is heavily simplified and often almost indistinguishable from the speech patterns of Orks. This linguistic similarity has led some scholars to speculate about possible historical connections between the two species, though most dismiss this as coincidence arising from similar levels of cognitive complexity. An Ogryn speech is direct, concrete, and often unintentionally hilarious in its literalism. When an Ogryn says, "I smash the bad things for the Emperor," it is not being poetic. It is providing a precise and accurate description of its job. Whereas when it says, "Boss say go there, so I go there," it is not being obsequious. It is expressing, in the most straightforward terms available to it, the depth of its commitment to following orders. This directness of communication is actually a tactical advantage in the chaos of battle, where complex orders can be misunderstood or lost in the noise and confusion. An order given to an Ogryn squad needs to be simple, clear, and unambiguous. Go there, fight those, protect that person, hold this position. These orders are easy to give, easy to understand, and easy to execute, which means that the communication overhead required to manage an Ogryn unit is actually lower than that required for many human units. There is no need for lengthy briefings or detailed tactical discussions. Somehow, there is no need to explain the strategic rationale behind an order or to motivate the troops with speeches about duty and honor. You just point and say, "Smash," and the smashing happens. The Imperium's classification of Ogryns as abhumans rather than mutants or xenos is a matter of significant political and theological importance that has implications for the species' status within Imperial society. Under Imperial law, abhumans are recognized as a stable variant of the human species and are granted a degree of citizenship that is denied to mutants and xenos. This means that Ogryns have legal protections, limited though they may be, that place them above most non-human entities in the Imperial hierarchy. They can serve in the military. They can receive rations and medical care. They can participate in the Imperial cult. And they can, at least theoretically, petition for redress of grievances through the administratum, though the likelihood of an Ogryn successfully navigating the Byzantine complexities of imperial bureaucracy is, admittedly, slim. This legal status is not secure, however. There are factions within the Inquisition, particularly among the more Puritan elements, who argue that Ogryns should be reclassified as mutants and subjected to the same persecution that other mutant populations face. These voices have been a constant background presence throughout the Imperium's history, and while they have never succeeded in changing the official classification, they have contributed to an atmosphere of suspicion and prejudice that many Ogryns face in their daily lives. But the fact that Ogryns are generally too dim to understand the political debates swirling around their existence is, in a perverse way, a kind of protection. You cannot be hurt by discrimination you do not comprehend. But the Imperium's ambivalence about its Ogryn population also represents a failure of imagination, a failure to recognize and fully exploit the extraordinary resource that these abhumans represent. If the Imperium were to invest more heavily in the Bone program, expanding it to enhance more Ogryns and developing even more advanced versions of the procedure, The result could be a corps of super soldiers whose physical capabilities rival those of space marines and whose loyalty is guaranteed in a way that even the Astartes cannot claim. The Ogryn Charonites of the Great Crusade era proved that this is possible. The technology exists. The raw material exists. All that is lacking is the will, the vision, and the political courage to invest in a population that too many in the Imperium regard as barely better than beasts. This failure of imagination is particularly frustrating when you compare it to the Orks' approach to utilizing their own population. The Orks may be chaotic, undisciplined, and self-destructive, but they are not wasteful of their individual members' potential. Every Ork has a place in the greenskin hierarchy, from the lowliest snotling to the mightiest war boss, and the mechanisms of Ork society, brutal though they are, ensure that the most capable individuals rise to positions where their abilities can be put to best use. The odd boys, the mech boys, and pain boys and weird boys are recognized and valued for their unique talents, and their skills are deployed effectively to support the Horde's war-making capabilities. The Imperium, by contrast, treats its Ogryns as a largely undifferentiated mass of muscle to be pointed at the enemy and forgotten. The bone program exists, but it is applied sparingly and selectively. The Bullgrin enhancement program exists, but it has not been expanded or evolved significantly in millennia. The potential for more advanced Ogryn augmentation, demonstrated by the Charonites and hinted at by cases like Cassia, remains largely unexplored. It is as if the Imperium looked at its Ogryns, saw big dumb brutes, and decided that big dumb brutes were all they could ever be. This is a mistake, and it is a mistake that the Orks, for all their many failings, do not make. Imagine, for a moment, what a fully optimized Ogryn military force might look like. Imagine Ogryn soldiers enhanced not just with the basic bone procedure, but with advanced cybernetic augmentations, improved armor systems, and weapons designed specifically to exploit their enormous strength and resilience. Imagine Ogryn special forces, teams of enhanced boneheads trained in demolitions, void warfare, and counterinsurgency operations, capable of operating independently in the most hostile environments in the galaxy. Imagine Ogryn heavy assault units, equipped with power armor scaled to their massive frames, carrying weapons that would normally be classified as vehicle-mounted, advancing through enemy fire with the implacable determination that only an Ogryn can muster. This is not science fiction within the science fiction, where this is something that the Imperium could actually do, with the technology and the resources it already possesses. The Space Marine chapters demonstrate what can be achieved when you take the basic template of a human being and enhance it through surgical, chemical, and cybernetic means. The Ogryns start from an even stronger baseline than the humans who become Space Marines, being larger, stronger, and more physically resilient before any enhancements are applied. If the same level of investment and attention were devoted to Ogryn enhancement as is devoted to the creation of Space Marines, the result would be a force that could match the Astartes in physical power while maintaining the absolute, unquestionable loyalty that is the Ogryns' greatest asset. But this is a fantasy, at least for now. The Imperium, hidebound by tradition, prejudice, and the grinding inertia of its own bureaucracy, continues to use its Ogryns in the same way it has used them for 10,000 years, as simple shock troops pointed at the enemy and expendable. It is a waste, a criminal, inexcusable waste of one of the most valuable human resources in the galaxy, and it is a waste that, if the comparison with the Orks teaches us anything, does not need to continue. This community response mirrors the broader appeal of Ogryns within the Warhammer 40,000 fan community. Ogryns have always been popular among fans, but in recent years, that popularity has reached new heights. The release of Nork Deadog as a standalone plastic kit was met with widespread enthusiasm. Fan-created content about Ogryns, from short stories to artwork to animated videos, has proliferated across the internet. And the ongoing debate about whether Ogryns are better than Orks, the very debate that this video addresses, has become one of the most popular and recurring topics in Warhammer 40,000 discussion forums and communities. Why? Because people love Ogryns, not in the ironic, detached way that people love orcs, appreciating their over-the-top violence and their absurd sense of humor from a safe distance. People genuinely love Ogryns, in the same way that they might love a particularly loyal and enthusiastic dog, or a child who is trying their absolute best, even though they do not quite understand what is going on. The Ogryns' combination of enormous physical power and childlike emotional simplicity creates a character archetype that is uniquely appealing, one that inspires not just admiration, but genuine affection. The Orks, by contrast, are admired, but not loved. People appreciate the Orks for what they are, a brilliant satire of militarism and machismo, a faction that takes the absurdity of war and cranks it up to 11, a source of endless humor and spectacle in a setting that can otherwise be relentlessly bleak. But nobody loves an orc the way they love an Ogryn. Nobody worries about an orc's feelings. Nobody writes fan fiction about an orc, forming a genuine emotional bond with its human comrades. The Orks are entertainment. The Ogryns are family. So let me bring this all together now. Let me make the case, the final and definitive case, for why Ogryns are better than orcs. But before I lay out the final argument point by point, I want to spend some time on a topic that we have touched on several times, but have not yet explored in the depth it deserves: the specific, undocumented failures of the orc model that demonstrate why numerical superiority and individual ferocity are not enough to make a species militarily superior. The history of the galaxy is littered with the wreckage of orc empires that burned bright and then collapsed in on themselves. The Beast, who arose in the 32nd Millennium and came closer to destroying the Imperium than any orc before or since, is the most dramatic example. The Beast, or more accurately the Beasts, because evidence suggests there were actually 6 of them operating in concert, led an orc invasion of such staggering scale that it dwarfed anything the Imperium had faced since the Horus Heresy. The Beast's forces were not the disorganized rabble that most Imperial commanders had come to expect from orc invasions. They were disciplined, coordinated, and equipped with technology that surpassed anything the orcs had previously demonstrated. They used gravity weapons that could devastate entire armies. They built attack moons, enormous asteroids converted into mobile battle stations that could threaten entire star systems. They even developed a rudimentary diplomatic capability, sending envoys to the Imperial Senate to demand surrender. And yet, the Beast's empire fell. Not because the Imperium's military was strong enough to defeat it, because for a long time it was not, but because the fundamental weaknesses of orc society, the same weaknesses that have doomed every orc empire in history, eventually reasserted themselves. When the 6 beasts were killed, one by one, through a combination of military action and heroic sacrifice by the Imperial Fist Chapter and the Death Watch, whilst the vast military machine they had assembled simply fell apart. The discipline and coordination that had made the beasts' forces so dangerous evaporated overnight, replaced by the familiar chaos of orc infighting, as thousands of warbands turned on each other in a scramble for leadership. This pattern repeats throughout orc history. The orc empire of Goro, which the emperor himself had to take the field against during the Great Crusade, wielding his legendary power claw to tear through the orc defenses. The stampeding crusade of warboss Snagrod, the arch-arsonist of Charadon, which devastated the world of Rin's world before eventually losing momentum as its logistics broke down and its constituent warbands began fighting each other over the diminishing spoils. The Octarius War, where the Imperium deliberately directed a Tyrannid splinter fleet into orc-held space, correctly predicting that the 2 species would become so absorbed in fighting each other that neither would pose a threat to Imperial space for decades, if not centuries. In every case, the orcs' inability to maintain cohesion and discipline over the long term proved to be their undoing, no matter how powerful their initial attack might have been. The Ogryns have no equivalent failures. This is not because Ogryns are perfect soldiers. They are not. It is because the system within which Ogryns operate does not depend on any single individual or any single factor for its functionality. An Ogryn squad that loses its bonehead does not descend into chaos. It attaches itself to the nearest authority figure and continues to follow orders. An Ogryn regiment that suffers heavy casualties does not fragment into squabbling factions. The survivors regroup, integrate with other units, and continue to fight. The Ogryn model of warfare is resilient in a way that the Ork model simply is not, because it is built on institutional structures rather than individual charisma. Consider also the long-term strategic implications of each species' approach to warfare. The Orks wage war as an end in itself, fighting for the sheer joy of combat without any coherent strategic objective beyond the immediate satisfaction of their aggressive impulses. A victorious Ork horde does not consolidate its gains, build infrastructure, or establish lasting governance over conquered territory. It moves on, looking for the next fight, leaving behind devastation and spores, but no enduring legacy of achievement. The Ork approach to strategy is essentially the approach of a wildfire: advance, consume, and move on, leaving nothing behind but ash and the promise of future regrowth. The Ogryns, as instruments of imperial policy, serve strategic objectives that extend far beyond the immediate battlefield. When an Ogryn regiment helps defend a world, it is defending not just the physical territory, but the industrial output, the population, the resources, and the strategic position that the world represents within the larger framework of imperial governance. When an Ogryn regiment helps conquer a world, it is not just seizing territory, but extending the reach of imperial civilization, bringing new populations under the protection of the emperor and new resources into the service of the Imperium's war machine. The Ogryn service has purpose and direction that extends beyond the moment of combat itself, and this strategic depth is yet another advantage that the Ork model, with its purely tactical focus, cannot match. There is a concept in military theory called combat power sustainment, which refers to the ability of a military force to maintain its effectiveness over extended periods of operation. It is not enough to be able to fight. You have to be able to keep fighting day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year, without your effectiveness degrading to the point where you can no longer achieve your objectives. This is where the Ork model fails most catastrophically. An Ork force at the beginning of a campaign is a terrifying thing, a green tide of muscle and metal that can overwhelm almost any defense through sheer weight of numbers and aggression. But that same force, 6 months into a campaign, is a shadow of its former self, its numbers depleted, its equipment deteriorating, its leadership fractured by internal power struggles, and its morale, if Orks can be said to have morale, sapped by the frustration of a fight that has gone on longer than the Orks' limited attention span can sustain. The Ogryns, supported by the Astra Militarum's logistical infrastructure, do not suffer from this degradation. Their equipment is maintained, their supplies are replenished, their casualties are replaced, if not immediately, then eventually, through the Imperium's vast recruitment networks. Their morale, anchored to their simple faith in the Emperor and their devotion to their comrades, does not waver over time. 6 months into a campaign, an Ogryn unit is every bit as effective as it was on the first day. 6 years into a campaign, it is still effective. 6 decades into a campaign, it is still effective. The Ogryns can sustain combat power indefinitely because the systems that support them are designed to operate on a timescale that the Orks simply cannot comprehend. This sustainment advantage is particularly important in the context of the 41st millennium, where wars can last for decades or even centuries, and where the ability to outlast your opponent is often more important than the ability to outfight them. The Siege of Vrax, which lasted 17 years, the Sabbat World's Crusade, which has been ongoing for decades, as the Octarius War, which shows no signs of ending. These are the conflicts that define the 41st millennium, grinding wars of attrition where the winner is not the side that fights hardest, but the side that fights longest. And in these conflicts, The Ogryns' reliability and the system that supports it provide an advantage that no amount of Ork ferocity can overcome. First, physicality. In terms of raw physical power, the average Ogryn is at least the equal of the average Ork boy, and in many cases, superior. An Ogryn stands taller, weighs more, and possesses a denser, more powerful musculature than a standard Ork. In a one-on-one fight with no weapons and no armor, the Ogryn's greater size and strength give it a significant advantage. Against larger Orks, specifically knobs, the matchup is closer, but even here, the Ogryn's toughness and pain tolerance give it an edge in a prolonged engagement. Only the very largest Orks, the war bosses and warlords who have grown to truly monstrous size through years of successful combat, can reliably overpower an Ogryn in a straight physical contest, and these represent a tiny fraction of the Ork population. Second, durability. Both species are extraordinarily tough, but they achieve their toughness through different mechanisms. The Ork's fungal symbiosis provides excellent redundancy and healing, but the Ogryn's sheer physical mass, dense bone structure, thick hide, and almost non-existent pain response provide comparable protection through purely physical means. And crucially, the Ogryn's toughness is consistent and predictable, while the Ork's is dependent on the vagaries of their hybrid biology and their unpredictable healing factor. An Ogryn that takes a hit will always respond in roughly the same way. An Ork that takes a hit might shrug it off, or might be more affected than expected, depending on a dozen biological variables that no one, not even the Ork itself, can predict. Third, reliability. This is the Ogryn's single greatest advantage, and it is not even close. An Ogryn does what it is told, when it is told, every single time. It does not deviate. It does not improvise. It does not decide that it would rather be doing something else. It follows orders with a devotion that borders on the religious, because for the Ogryn, following orders literally is religious. An Ork, by contrast, does what it wants, when it wants. And the concept of following orders is at best a vague suggestion that it may or may not choose to honor depending on its mood, its level of excitement, and whether it has recently been punched in the face by someone bigger than it. In a military context, where the ability to execute a plan depends entirely on the willingness of the troops to follow that plan, the Ogryn's reliability is worth more than all the Ork ferocity in the galaxy. Fourth, loyalty. Related to reliability, but distinct from it. An Ogryn's loyalty is not just about following orders. It is about caring about the outcome, about wanting to protect its comrades and serve its cause, about having a genuine emotional stake in the success of the mission. This loyalty drives the Ogryn to acts of heroism that go far beyond the call of duty, or from Nork Deadog dragging a chimera through enemy fire to the nameless Ogryns who have thrown themselves on grenades, shielded wounded officers with their bodies, and fought to the last breath against overwhelming odds because the alternative was letting their friends die. The Orks have bravery, certainly, and they have a love of combat that can seem like fearlessness, but they do not have loyalty. They do not have love. And in the final analysis, love is a more powerful motivator than hatred could ever be. Fifth, integration. Ogryns work within a system. They are part of the Astra Militarum, plugged into a military infrastructure that provides them with everything they need to be effective. Equipment, supplies, transportation, command and control, medical support, and a clear chain of command that gives them purpose and direction. The Orks have no comparable infrastructure. Their armies are assembled on the fly from whatever mobs happen to be in the area, armed with whatever scrap can be salvaged, and held together by nothing more than the personal authority of whoever happens to be the biggest and the loudest. When that authority is removed, the army disintegrates. The Ogryn, embedded in a system that can survive the loss of any individual, is a permanent asset. The Ork, dependent on a single charismatic leader, is a temporary one. Sixth, the intangibles. The morale boost that an Ogryn provides to the human soldiers it serves alongside is incalculable. The sight of an Ogryn advancing into enemy fire, shrugging off hits that would cut a human in half, swinging its ripper gun like a club and roaring its simple war cry, is one of the most inspiring things a guardsman can see on the battlefield. It is a physical embodiment of the idea that size and strength and courage can overcome any obstacle, and it gives the human soldiers around it the confidence to keep fighting when every instinct is screaming at them to run. The Orks inspire fear. The Ogryns inspire courage. And in the long, grinding war of attrition that defines the Imperium's struggle for survival, courage is the more valuable commodity. Now, I want to be fair. I want to acknowledge the areas where the Orks genuinely do have advantages over the Ogryns, because any honest comparison must account for both sides of the ledger. The Orks have numbers, overwhelming, crushing, functionally infinite numbers. No matter how many Orks you kill, there are always more, and there always will be. Oh, the Ogryns cannot match this, and they never will. The Orks have the Gestalt psychic field, a collective supernatural ability that bends reality to match their expectations. This gives them a technological flexibility that no other species in the galaxy can match, allowing them to build functional weapons and vehicles from literal garbage. The Ogryns have no supernatural abilities whatsoever, and they rely entirely on the technology provided to them by the Imperium. But even the Gestalt psychic field, for all its remarkable properties, comes with limitations that are often overlooked in discussions of Ork capabilities. The field works through collective belief. If enough Orks believe that a thing will work, it works. If enough Orks believe that a vehicle will go faster because it is painted red, it goes faster. If enough Orks believe that a gun will fire even though it has no logical firing mechanism, it fires. This is an extraordinary ability, but it is also a fundamentally fragile one because it depends on the presence of a critical mass of Ork minds to sustain it. When Ork populations are reduced below a certain threshold, the Gestalt field weakens, and the technology that depended on it begins to fail. Weapons that worked perfectly well when there were 1,000 Orks around suddenly jam or misfire when the local population drops to a few dozen. Vehicles that roared across the battlefield with impressive speed grind to a halt when there are not enough greenskin minds in the vicinity to sustain the psychic fiction that they should be able to move at all. Man, this means that the Orks' technological advantage is inherently tied to their numerical advantage. And when one fails, the other fails with it. An Ork warband that has been ground down by attrition does not just lose bodies. It loses the psychic infrastructure that makes its remaining technology function. The decline is not linear, but exponential, a cascading failure where each loss makes the next loss more likely. The Ogryns' technology suffers no such vulnerability. A Ripper gun works the same whether there is one Ogryn on the battlefield or 1,000. A Bullgrin's slab shield provides the same protection whether the squad is at full strength or down to its last member. The technology that the Imperium provides to its Ogryn soldiers is based on sound engineering principles that do not require a psychic consensus to function. As it is heavy, it is crude by the standards of some civilizations, and it is not particularly sophisticated. But it works. It always works, and it will keep working until the barrel melts or the ammunition runs dry, regardless of how many friendly minds happen to be in the vicinity. This is not a minor consideration. In the grinding attritional warfare that characterizes most conflicts in the 41st millennium, the ability to maintain technological functionality even as casualties mount is a critical factor in determining which side prevails. The Orks' Gestalt field makes them formidable at full strength, but it also makes them increasingly vulnerable as their numbers are reduced, creating a tipping point beyond which their entire military capability can collapse with startling speed. The Ogryns face no such tipping point, whilst their effectiveness scales linearly with their numbers, declining gradually and predictably as casualties are taken, without the sudden catastrophic failure that characterizes Ork forces in extremis. Let me also address a dimension of the comparison that we have not yet explored in sufficient depth. The process by which each species produces its warriors the training and the development that transforms raw biological material into a functional soldier. Because the differences between how Ogryns and Orks become the fighters they are reveal fundamental truths about the nature of each species and the quality of the soldiers they produce. An Ork does not train. An Ork does not learn. An Ork does not undergo a process of deliberate development that transforms it from a civilian into a soldier. An Ork is born, or more accurately sprouted, with its combat instincts already hardwired into its nervous system by the genetic programming of the old ones. From the moment it emerges from the ground, it knows how to fight. It knows how to use weapons. It knows, on some instinctive level, the basics of tactics and strategy. Though these instincts are crude and unsophisticated compared to the deliberate training that characterizes most other military forces in the galaxy. This innate combat programming is, in some ways, an advantage. It means that Ork forces can be assembled and deployed with minimal preparation. There is no boot camp, no basic training, no months-long process of physical conditioning and tactical instruction that must be completed before a new recruit is ready for combat. An Ork boy is ready for combat the moment it picks up a weapon. And in some cases even before that, relying on its fists and its teeth until something sharper comes along. But this advantage comes at a cost. Because Ork combat instincts are innate rather than learned, they are also inflexible. An Ork fights the way its genetics tell it to fight, and while that way is effective enough against most opponents, it lacks the adaptability that comes from deliberate training and instruction. An Ork that has been fighting the same way for its entire life will continue to fight the same way, even when the situation demands a different approach. It cannot learn new tactics in the way that a trained soldier can. It cannot adapt to novel threats in the way that a trained soldier can. It cannot incorporate lessons from past battles in the way that a trained soldier can. The Ork is a natural warrior, but it is also a static one, locked into patterns of behavior that were programmed millions of years ago and that have not evolved since. Ogryns, by contrast, undergo a deliberate process of training and development that, while adapted to their limited intellectual capacity, is nonetheless a genuine program of military instruction. Ogryn recruits are inducted into the Astra Militarum through the Militarum Auxilia and subjected to a training regimen that has been refined over thousands of years to get the best possible results from their unique combination of enormous physical power and limited cognitive ability. The training focuses on the fundamentals, marching in formation, following simple orders, recognizing the chain of command, operating their assigned weapons, and most importantly, understanding who the enemy is and why they need to be fought. This last point is critical, because an Ogryn's motivation in battle is directly tied to its understanding of why it is fighting. An Ogryn that understands, even in the simplest terms, that it is protecting the Emperor and its friends, will fight with a determination that no amount of genetic programming can match. The training process does not just teach Ogryns how to fight, it gives them a reason to fight, a purpose that goes beyond instinct and that sustains them through the worst that the galaxy can throw at them. The bone procedure, which we discussed earlier, adds another layer of sophistication to the Ogryn training process. Boneheads, Ogryns who have undergone the biochemical Ogryn neural enhancement, may receive additional tactical instruction that allows them to serve as squad leaders, interpreting complex orders from human officers and translating them into the simple, direct commands that their squad mates can understand and follow. This creates a two-tier command structure within Ogryn units that combines the flexibility of human tactical thinking with the raw physical power of Ogryn execution. The Bonehead serves as a bridge between the human command structure and the Ogryn fighting force, ensuring that orders are transmitted accurately and executed effectively. This training infrastructure is another area where the Ogryn model demonstrates a clear advantage over the Ork model. The Ork's innate combat programming produces warriors who are immediately effective but who cannot improve or adapt. The Ogryn's deliberate training process produces warriors who may take longer to reach their full potential, but who are more flexible, more disciplined, and more responsive to command and control than their green-skinned counterparts. In a short, sharp engagement where raw aggression is the primary determinant of success, the Orcs' innate programming may give it an edge. But in a sustained campaign, where adaptability, discipline, and the ability to execute complex plans are the deciding factors, the Ogryns' trained professionalism wins every time. The recruitment process itself also favors the Ogryn model in subtle but important ways. Ogryn homeworlds are integrated into the Imperium's tithe system, which ensures a steady, as predictable supply of recruits that can be planned for and managed by the Departamento Munitorum's logistics apparatus. The Imperium knows how many Ogryns it has. It knows where they are. It knows how many new recruits each homeworld can be expected to produce in a given year. This allows for long-term military planning of a kind that is simply impossible with Orc forces, whose numbers and locations are inherently unpredictable. The Orcs, by contrast, produce their warriors through a process that is completely uncontrolled and uncontrollable. Spores settle, fungal ecosystems develop, and Orcs emerge in numbers and on timescales that no one, not even the Orcs themselves, can predict. This means that Orc military strength is inherently unpredictable, waxing and waning according to ecological factors that have nothing to do with strategic planning or military necessity. An Orc warboss who launches a campaign with 1 million boys at his back has no guarantee that he will be able to replace casualties at the rate they are sustained. If the local fungal ecosystem is productive, reinforcements will appear quickly. If not, the warboss may find his army shrinking faster than it can be replenished, with no ability to influence the process in either direction. This unpredictability is a strategic liability of the First Order. Military planning depends on the ability to predict and control the availability of resources, including manpower. A commander who cannot predict how many soldiers will be available for a given operation cannot plan that operation with any confidence. And a commander who cannot control the rate at which casualties are replaced cannot manage attrition or allocate reserves effectively. The Orc model, for all its impressive productivity, provides neither prediction nor control, and the result is a military force that is powerful but unreliable, fearsome but unmanageable, and ultimately less effective than a smaller force that can be planned for, controlled, and directed with precision. The Orcs have their odd boys, specialists like mech boys and pain boys and weird boys who provide capabilities that the Ogryns simply do not have. An Ogryn cannot build a tank. An Ogryn cannot perform surgery. An Ogryn cannot channel psychic energy to fry enemies or teleport allies across the battlefield. In terms of the range and diversity of their capabilities, the Orcs have a clear advantage. And the Orcs have their sheer, unbridled enthusiasm for violence, a love of fighting that is so deep and so all-consuming that it occasionally wraps back around to being almost philosophical. There is something admirable about a species that is so perfectly adapted to its purpose, so completely at peace with what it is and what it does, that it can face annihilation with a grin and a war cry. The Ogryns fight because they are told to, because they love their emperor and their comrades and they want to protect them. The Orcs fight because fighting is what they are, the whole of their existence, the alpha and the omega, the beginning and the end. And there is a purity to that which the Ogryns, for all their admirable qualities, cannot quite match. But when all these factors are weighed against each other, but when the strengths and weaknesses of each species are measured against the demands of warfare in the 41st millennium, the conclusion is clear. The Ogryns are better. Not in every way, not in every situation, not by every possible metric, but in the ways that matter most, in the qualities that determine whether a soldier is a reliable, effective, and valuable asset to the army it serves. The Ogryns come out on top. They are strong enough to fight anything the galaxy can throw at them. They are tough enough to survive encounters that would destroy lesser creatures. They are loyal enough to be trusted absolutely, without reservation, in any situation. They are reliable enough to be counted on to follow orders and hold the line no matter what. And they are good enough in the moral sense, in the sense that their capacity for love and devotion makes them something more than just weapons, something more than just tools, something that approaches, in its own simple and unsophisticated way, the best of what humanity has to offer. In a galaxy that is defined by its darkness, by its cruelty, by its relentless and seemingly purposeless suffering, the Ogryns are a reminder that strength and loyalty and love are not just abstractions. They are forces as real and as powerful as any weapon or any army, forces that can hold a line and win a battle and save a life. The Orks may be more numerous, they may be more versatile, they may even be more fun to watch from a safe distance. But when the chips are down, when the line is breaking, when the enemy is at the gates, and everything depends on whether someone will stand and fight, and the Ogryn is the one you want beside you, not the Ork. The Ogryn, every time. The Orks will always be a threat. They will always be there, lurking at the edges of civilized space, gathering in the dark places between the stars, breeding and building, and waiting for the next great stampeding crusade to sweep across the galaxy. They are a fact of life in the 41st millennium, as inevitable and as inescapable as death itself. But the Ogryns will be there too, standing in the path of the green tide, their ripper guns roaring and their war cries echoing across the battlefield, fighting not for the joy of violence, but for the love of the people behind them, the little uns, who depend on them for protection and who have earned their devotion through nothing more than the simple act of being kind. And in the end, well, that is why the Ogryns are better. Not because they are bigger, not because they are stronger, not because they can crush an Ork's skull with a headbutt or drag a chimera through a war zone, but because they care, because they love, because in a galaxy that has been stripped of almost everything that makes existence bearable, they have held on to the one thing that matters most, their connection to the people around them and their willingness to die for them. That is not just military effectiveness. That is not just tactical advantage. That is not just a comparison of biology and equipment and battlefield performance. That is a statement about what it means to be alive in the 41st millennium, about what it means to be human, even when you are not entirely human yourself. And it is a statement that the Ogryns make every time they step onto the battlefield, every time they raise their weapons and charge into the teeth of the enemy, every time they put their enormous bodies between their friends and the forces that would destroy them. Ogryns are better than Orks, not because they are perfect, not because they are unbeatable, but because they are good, in the most fundamental, most important, most human sense of the word. They are good. And in the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war and the laughter of thirsting gods, goodness is the rarest and most precious thing in the galaxy. So the next time you see an Ogryn on the battlefield, whether it is on the tabletop, in a video game, or in the pages of a novel, take a moment to appreciate what you are looking at. Yet you are not just looking at a big, dumb, tough guy with a gun. You are looking at one of the finest soldiers in the galaxy, a creature whose loyalty and courage and love for its comrades make it something more than just a weapon, something more than just a tool, something that embodies the best qualities of the species from which it was descended, even as it has been transformed into something that species might not fully recognize. The Ogryns do not get the glory, they do not get the songs, they do not get the monuments and the memorials and the chapters of history dedicated to their deeds. They are the Imperium's forgotten heroes, the silent giants who hold the line while others claim the credit. But they deserve better. They deserve to be remembered, to be celebrated, and to be recognized for what they are. The best soldiers the Imperium has, and the finest example of what loyalty and courage can achieve in a universe that seems determined to crush both. I want to close with one final thought, one last observation that ties together everything we have discussed over the course of this conversation. And it has to do with what each species represents in the larger context of the Warhammer 40,000 setting, not just as military forces, but as symbols, as ideas, as reflections of different ways of existing in a universe that is actively hostile to existence itself. The Orks represent a particular kind of freedom. They are liberated from doubt, from regret, from the existential weight that crushes so many other species in the galaxy. They do not worry about the future because they do not think about the future. They do not mourn the past because they do not remember the past. They exist entirely in the present moment, fully committed to whatever they happen to be doing, whether that is fighting, building, eating, or arguing about who gets to fight next. There is something admirable about this, something almost enviable about a species that is so perfectly adapted to its environment that it experiences nothing but satisfaction in the act of being what it is. The Orks are, in a strange and somewhat uncomfortable way, the happiest species in the galaxy. They are never bored, they are never lonely, they are never disappointed. They simply are what they are, fully and completely, without reservation or regret. But happiness is not the same as goodness, and contentment is not the same as value. The Orks are happy, but their happiness is built on a foundation of destruction and suffering. Every world they touch is diminished by their presence. Every civilization they encounter is threatened by their aggression. Every life they take is a life that had meaning and purpose beyond the Orks' desire for entertainment. The Orks' freedom from emotional complexity is not a virtue. It is a limitation, an inability to appreciate the consequences of its own actions, an incapacity for the kind of moral awareness that separates a sentient being from a natural disaster. The Ogryns represent something different, something harder to achieve, something more fragile, something that requires constant effort and constant reinforcement, but something that is infinitely more valuable. But the Ogryns represent the possibility of goodness in a universe that seems designed to prevent it. They represent the idea that loyalty can endure in a galaxy where betrayal is commonplace, that love can survive in a reality where cruelty is the norm, that simple kindness can persist in an environment where kindness is actively punished. The Ogryns' faith in the Emperor is not sophisticated. It does not grapple with the theological complexities that consume the scholars and priests of the ecclesiarchy. It does not question or doubt or demand proof. It is simple and direct and absolute. The faith of a child who trusts its parent because trusting its parent is the most natural thing in the world. And yet, precisely because of its simplicity, the Ogryns' faith is among the purest expressions of devotion in the entire Imperium. It is a faith that cannot be corrupted by ambition, because the Ogryn has no ambition. It cannot be twisted by pride, because the Ogryn has no pride. It cannot be undermined by doubt, because the Ogryn does not know how to doubt. The Ogryn believes, with every fiber of its enormous being, that the Emperor is good, and that serving the Emperor is the highest calling any creature can aspire to. And while more sophisticated theologians might quibble with the details, the essential truth of that belief is unassailable. This faith, this simple and unshakable devotion, is the foundation upon which the Ogryns' entire military effectiveness is built. It is not the size of their muscles, or the thickness of their hide, or the caliber of their ripper guns that makes Ogryns better than Orks. It is the love in their hearts, the loyalty in their souls, and the unbreakable bond they form with the people they are sworn to protect. These are the qualities that no amount of green muscle or gestalt psychic energy can replicate. These are the qualities that make the Ogryn not just a better soldier than the Ork, but a better being. The Imperium of man is a dark and terrible place, a civilization that has sacrificed almost everything that makes civilization worthwhile in the name of survival. Its citizens live in fear and ignorance. Its leaders are corrupt and self-serving. Its institutions are sclerotic and oppressive. And yet, within this vast machinery of suffering and control, there exist pockets of genuine goodness, moments of real connection and authentic care that survive despite everything the galaxy does to stamp them out. The Ogryns are one of those pockets. That they are a reminder that even in the worst circumstances imaginable, it is possible to be kind. It is possible to be loyal. It is possible to love. I often think about what it would be like to be a guardsman in the 41st millennium, a baseline human thrust into a conflict of unimaginable scale and ferocity, armed with a flashlight that the Departamento Munitorum insists on calling a weapon and protected by a piece of cardboard that the Departamento Munitorum insists on calling armor. The fear must be overwhelming. The sense of insignificance, of being a single grain of sand in a desert of violence and death, must be crushing. Every day is a coin flip, every battle a lottery, and the prize for losing is a death so horrible that the human imagination struggles to encompass it. And then an Ogryns sits down next to you, this enormous, ridiculous, a beautiful creature that weighs as much as a small vehicle and has the intellectual capacity of a particularly bright golden retriever. It does not understand why you are afraid. It does not understand the strategic implications of the enemy's advance or the logistical challenges facing the supply chain. It does not understand that you are probably going to die tomorrow, and even if it did understand, it would not know what to do with that information. But it knows that you are its friend. It knows that you are scared, and it puts its enormous arm around your shoulders, gently enough not to break anything, and tells you in its booming, cheerful, gloriously uncomplicated voice that everything is going to be all right, because the Emperor loves us, and we are going to smash the bad things together. And in that moment, despite everything, as despite the darkness and the horror and the overwhelming certainty of doom, you believe it, because the Ogryn believes it. And the Ogryn's belief, simple and stupid and completely divorced from the reality of the situation, is somehow the most convincing argument for hope that you have ever heard. That is why Ogryns are better than Orks, not because they are bigger or stronger or tougher or better armed, but because they make the people around them better. They make scared people brave. They make lonely people feel loved. They make hopeless people believe that maybe, just maybe, things are going to be all right. And in the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war and the laughter of thirsting gods, that is a gift beyond any price. And that gift, that quiet, steadfast, unshakable presence, and is something the galaxy needs now more than ever. The Great Rift has torn reality in two. The Tyranids press in from beyond the galactic rim. The Necrons are awakening from their tombs in numbers not seen since the war in heaven. Chaos grows bolder with every passing year, its champions and its demons spilling through the thin veil between real space and the warp with increasing frequency and increasing malice. The Imperium faces threats on every front, enemies within and enemies without, and the resources to fight them all grow thinner with every passing decade. In this environment, every soldier counts, every asset matters, every advantage, no matter how small, could be the difference between survival and extinction. And the Ogryns, those magnificent, ridiculous, endlessly lovable mountains of muscle and loyalty, represent an advantage that the Imperium has been underutilizing for 10,000 years. They are stronger than almost anything they will face on the battlefield. They are tougher than ceramite and more stubborn than a Hablock foundation. They are loyal, beyond question, brave beyond measure, and devoted to their cause with a purity that would shame a saint. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the world of Ogryns and why they stand head and shoulders, quite literally, above their green-skinned counterparts, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. There is so much more to explore in the grim darkness of the far future, so many stories to tell, and so many corners of the lore to illuminate, and I want to take you on every one of those journeys. Drop a comment below and let me know what you think. Are Ogryns really better than Orks? Do you have a favorite Ogryn story or a favorite moment from Darktide that perfectly captures what makes these big, beautiful abhumans so special? I want to hear from you, because this community is built on conversations just like this one, and every single voice matters. Share this video with someone who needs convincing, someone who still thinks the Green Tide is the most impressive force in the galaxy. Show them what real strength looks like. Show them what loyalty means when it is backed by 1,000 kilograms of bone and muscle and heart. Until next time, stay loyal, stay strong, and remember, brute force not work. It because you not use enough of it. For the Emperor.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.